The girl got married 5 times by age 16. Like her neighbor Rose, she was born into royalty but faced a tragic fate. Throughout her life, she was manipulated by her family, but with one difference. Rose dominated throughout. But Ruby, our protagonist, was different. To stay alive, she had to suppress her disgust and play the role of an innocent flower. Her family seemed to love her, but in reality they were all more twisted than each other. She had to sit on her older brother's lap during meals. Her father, despite being an all-powerful pope, used his daughter in fraudulent marriages for his own benefit. People said the pope's daughter was a spy, a woman of poor character and evil ways. And now, he had found another good husband for his daughter. Second brother Gio still had some conscience. It hadn't even been 3 months since his last marriage. As the strongest knight of the South, he could go to the battlefield himself. Faced with such drama, Ruby felt dizzy. What must come will come. She forced a smile and asked, "So who is it this time?" Father said kindly, "It's the pride of Polentana. Not only is he the king's most beloved nephew, but he's also a powerful knight of the north and extremely handsome." But what he never expected was that this extremely handsome man would later slaughter his entire in-law family. After being stunned for 3 seconds, her brother came close to his sister's ear. Gently stroking her cheek, Ruby felt both fearful and resistant. Even if she was unwilling, she could only very happily accept father's proposal. Her parents praised her for being so good. Brother also contentedly kissed her forehead. "Our Ruby is so good." Ruby vomited all her food in disgust. In this life, she wasn't much different from her previous one. The family that adopted her only appeared harmonious on the surface. In fact, her adoptive parents had both cheated on each other. The only sister who was kind to her had died. The eldest brother seemed normal, but he was actually a pervert like her adoptive father. If she showed any slight disobedience, she would pay a painful price. Unexpectedly, this life was identical to her previous one. As an evil woman, she was destined to be killed by righteous people, and it would be her marriage partner. The male lead Iske possessed both beauty and strength, but he was an ascetic handsome man. He never showed interest in women. However, he was extremely good to his sister. The reason he agreed to marry Ruby was to prevent his sister from marrying that bastard Gio, and the reason for slaughtering his in-laws was because his sister was poisoned by his wife. No one could have imagined that the princess who received endless love was actually a puppet being manipulated. Everything was controlled by her brother behind the scenes. This time, after being apart for just a short while, her brother came to play nice again. If she wasn't happy with this marriage, she could tell him. Ruby just wanted to roll her eyes at her brother twice. If she told the truth, she'd definitely get beaten up. She turned her head away nervously. "It's not that I'm unhappy, I just want to live with brother forever." Brother gently held his sister's head. Despite his seeming human appearance, who knows what he might do the next second? While showing endless affection for his sister, he continued to use and hurt her. His split personality was chilling. Having suffered greatly, Ruby found a way to survive. That was to act. She squeezed out 2 tears, appearing very reluctant to leave her brother. Brother looked at her tenderly. "Just think of it as going on a trip. I'll come get you back in just half a year." He told his sister not to worry too much, he would visit her often. Ruby felt speechless. Whether he visited or not really didn't matter. She just wanted to stay alive now. Soon it was her wedding day. On the surface she cried, appearing very reluctant to leave, but in her heart she couldn't be happier. Father apologized for not letting brother accompany his daughter. Ruby played along with father's act of paternal love, but in reality she wanted to give him a hard slap. He clearly knew that rumors about her relationship with her brother were spreading wildly. Couldn't he see how much the northern envoys disliked her? Was he going blind or just pretending not to understand? The only somewhat normal person in this family was Gio. Although he was prideful and prone to causing trouble, he had never hurt Ruby. She would probably really miss him later. However, her controlling older brother showed no reluctance to part with her. "Anyway, once you're married and stay there for half a year, I'll come bring you home." But this time his wishes wouldn't come true. This time she was determined not to return, leaving her disgusting family behind. Her husband wasn't a good person either. Even though the bride had arrived, he was still chatting idly with friends in the wilderness. But it didn't matter. Ruby hadn't hoped for her husband's love anyway. Since he wouldn't come to receive her, she would walk back herself. In the huge castle, only her husband's sister Erin received her. Erin was beautiful but cold in demeanor. Ruby was stunned by her beauty at just a glance. She showed a harmless smile, wanting to get closer to her sister-in-law. After all, she had a bad reputation. But her sister-in-law always maintained a stern face, still calling her Madame. This made her somewhat awkward. She hesitated for a long while. "Can you call me Ruby?" Although saying this showed a lack of pride. But she was alone in a foreign land, both confused and afraid. "Okay." Erin didn't hesitate. Ruby was excited like a child. She tightly held her sister-in-law's hands, showing immense gratitude. "Can I call you Erin too?" she asked shyly. "I don't want you to be overly cautious here, but being too polite can easily lead to misunderstandings." Meaning, stop pretending, just show your true nature. No one knew that the notorious evil woman was actually a silly fool. Ruby was used to such misunderstandings, as long as people thought she wasn't threatening enough. After dinner it was time to rest. This room is truly my dream room. Not only did it have a large balcony, but from it you could see the pink ocean. This was all sister-in-law's work. I wonder if Madame is satisfied? How could she not be satisfied? Ruby was more than satisfied, but brother has gone out to fight monsters. If he returns late, you should rest early, Aaron apologized. But Ruby was secretly delighted. Best if he never returned. She never wanted her husband's love. The imagination was beautiful, but reality was harsh. She woke up freezing in the middle of the night. It turned out the fire had been extinguished. She immediately had a bad feeling. She had heard that the north had many monsters, and holy fire was lit every night. Unless someone deliberately extinguished it, the holy fire wouldn't go out for no reason. She suddenly remembered the maid who had been following behind the holy fire during the day. Her gaze had been strange. Could it have been her? Thinking of this, Ruby's scalp tingled. Suddenly, there was a whooshing sound from behind. Now she was really in trouble. She wanted to escape, but her body wouldn't move. The maid screamed in terror. Her sister-in-law shouted her name and rushed in. At the critical moment, a sharp sword flashed. The monster was killed with one strike. Ruby opened her eyes to look. The person who saved her was her husband, who disliked her. Why did you do this? Her husband's eyes were cold. He believed the woman was staging this herself. Actually, one couldn't blame him for thinking this way. Who made the Princess of Rotana have such a bad reputation? Not only had she been married 5 times, she had also hurt several husbands. One of them was rejected for marriage because she said his thing was too small. Since then, he had become reclusive and never left home. No one was more eye-catching than this woman. Male lead Isuke darkened his face. Or is this one of your excuses to break off the marriage? Ruby had expected her husband to dislike her, but didn't expect her image had fallen to such depths. How would she live her days from now on? Fortunately, sister-in-law was nice. She began speaking up for Ruby. Ruby's eyes welled with tears, vowing to protect sister-in-law well. She moved closer to sister-in-law, explaining that she really did wake up to find the fire extinguished. Is someone trying to harm you? My sister or me? Isuke didn't believe a word she said. Alright, maybe I sleepwalked and put it out myself. Ruby admitted fault while crying, promising never to do it again. Perhaps unable to bear seeing a woman cry. Though Isuke wanted to ask more, he finally turned and left. On her first day of marriage, she left her husband with an extremely bad impression. Ruby, who already had anorexia, completely lost her appetite. Sister-in-law promised her such things wouldn't happen again. But to survive, Ruby had no choice but to try pleasing her husband, only by appearing as innocent as possible. When sister-in-law was poisoned, would she have a chance of surviving under her husband's hand? She carried a fruit basket, and thick-skinned went to her husband's training camp. Her heart was racing with anxiety. Who are you looking for? A blonde man startled her. He was part of yesterday's wedding escort, so he recognized Ruby at a glance. Hearing she was looking for her husband, his jaw nearly dropped in shock. Hey Isuke, your wife is here. Your wife came to find you. Then came Isuke's cursing voice. Ruby hid behind a pillar, breaking out in cold sweat. Isuke suddenly appeared behind her. What are you doing here? Ruby stammered that because of this morning's incident, she came to see if he was angry. Isuke looked thoroughly impatient. Now that you've seen, go back. Watching her husband walking further away, Ruby hurriedly went forward and grabbed him. Unexpectedly, husband turned around, knocking over her fruit basket. This was her bonus point weapon, and sister-in-law had said these fruits were very expensive. Following the principle that food dropped within 3 seconds isn't dirty, she quickly picked up the fruits. What are you doing now? Not only did her husband not help, he even stole her lines. She was furious, but still had to say sorry. Since that's how it is, don't blame her for being unreasonable. Her tears poured out frantically. I just came to clear up misunderstandings. However, husband wasn't moved by this. He even felt it wouldn't matter if he was dumped by a woman today. This wasn't what protagonist Ruby wanted. She had to try something more dramatic. I like you, it was love at first sight, she confessed with all her might, making all the knights cheer for her wildly. Oh yeah, she really admired her own acting skills. Husband turned back, his eyes full of killing intent. Ruby felt too guilty to look directly at him. She knew she didn't deserve to be liked. But among those who saved her from danger, husband was the first. I just admire you, want to repay you, is that not okay? She had already confessed to a man, even if people thought it childish. As long as she got a response, there was still hope. However, when she opened her eyes, he was already gone. But she wouldn't give up. While husband wasn't dealt with yet, a love rival appeared. She was Isuke's childhood friend Floria. Hello, Lady Rudabea. The maid's looks at her all changed. Ruby sensed danger. Who doesn't know how to act cute? I'm very happy to meet you too. Her performance left even her love rival stunned. Judging by that look, she probably wasn't a good person either. Today was the palace night banquet. Sister-in-law Erin and Floria, with their good backgrounds and looks, became everyone's targets for flattery. Ruby remembered her former self. No matter how miserable she was behind the scenes, as long as she held the title of Pope's daughter, she was envied by thousands. But now compared to the Northerners, she was like a dwarf. Yet this didn't stop others from flattering her, because they all wanted to know the Pope's movements. These people are so thick-skinned wind, sister-in-law suddenly commented. Ruby almost dropped her jaw. Her words really didn't match her beauty. But what happened next left her completely frozen. Her love rival actually called her husband's nickname intimately right in front of her. Isuke turned his head at the sound, only to see his wife greeting him. He immediately turned and left, leaving Ruby extremely awkward. The love rival stood beside her sympathizing, saying she would go teach Isuke a lesson. Ruby's small hands clenched tighter and tighter. She strode towards that pair of backs. Anyway, everyone already knew she was neglected on her first wedding night and her husband was always avoiding her. Might as well go all out. She doesn't mind embarrassing herself again. Seeing how aggressively she approached, everyone thought she was going to fight. They all felt nervous for her. "I'm so happy to see you." She showed a sunny smile, boldly praising her husband for looking handsome today. Although she super wanted to slap the man twice, she now had to work hard at being a good fan. Isuke frowned slightly. "Was this woman sick? Didn't you firmly promise not to bother me?" Ruby was touched. Husband actually remembered what she said. She was satisfied. "I absolutely won't appear to bother you in the future," because she would only hide and watch secretly. Thinking the act had gone far enough, she better escape quickly. Unexpectedly, husband suddenly grabbed her shoulder. "Do you want to die?" Ruby was completely confused. Had she triggered some death trap? Of course she didn't want to die, but the hand on her shoulder pressed harder and harder. "Then why do you want to hide and watch me?" She was in tears from the pain. "I just want to see you so much." Did husband suspect she wanted to assassinate him? That would obviously be suicide. Could she do that? The blonde-haired man stepped forward at this point. "Miss, this behavior is indeed very dangerous." Ruby didn't understand. It turned out that Northern Knights usually enhance their power to track magical artifacts. Knights would enter an overexcited state. If anyone was nearby, they could accidentally be hurt by the powerful sword energy. Ruby awkwardly fidgeted. Well, who made her a native southerner? She had already apologized, but husband showed no sign of letting go. Aaron complained that brother didn't go home. The love rival also patted his shoulder, agreeing. "How can you bear to leave when there are so many beauties at home?" But Isuke listened to no one. The love rival complained publicly that Isuke no longer listened to her. Sister-in-law couldn't help but comment that her brother never listened to anyone, not even bothering to pretend. The love rival feigned surprise and turned to Ruby. "Madam, do you like horseback riding?" Ruby smiled foolishly. "Although I'm not very good at riding, I quite like it." But she was lying. Although her previous life wasn't good, she had learned all the noble sports thoroughly. At times like this, there's always someone who likes to stir up trouble. Floria's riding skills were personally taught by Isuke. The blonde woman watched with amusement, eager to see them clash publicly. Ruby didn't mind at all. When it came to acting, she was an expert. She smiled foolishly. "Thank you for your concern, but I can't take up a busy person's time over such a trivial matter, neither offensive nor unreasonable." Who could find fault with that? Seeing they couldn't stir up trouble, the gossipy ladies started discussing the swordsmanship competition held every 3 years. Ruby's big brother would surely come then. One husband was troublesome enough, now adding a big brother, she felt depressed and drank a few more cups. She went out for some air but almost got knocked over. Ruby glanced. It was a handsome man with curly hair, Roland, Floria's brother. Although she had a harmless face and smiled apologetically, his gaze made people feel chilled. Seeing the incoming hostility, Ruby knew she was his most hated person. Sure enough, after just a few words of flattery, Roland suddenly changed tone. "Who in this world doesn't know Madame's reputation? You are the Pope's daughter after all." His words were full of sarcasm. Ruby played dumb as usual, saying she really had no achievements worth mentioning. Hearing this, Roland got even more excited. "There's a popular song lately that's perfect for you." He cleared his throat. The lyrics basically mocked Ruby's inappropriate relationship with her non-blood brother. Unfortunately, he only sang halfway before someone grabbed his ear. "How dare you talk nonsense in front of Madame? I'll tear your mouth apart." Roland's ear was distorted from being pulled. Ruby awkwardly helped plead for him. She didn't want to hear this person's apology at all. Once his ear was released, Roland fled like a rat. The blonde man looked very apologetic, respectfully apologizing to Madame, worried she had a bad experience. Ruby looked pitiful, saying she was actually used to it, just afraid her husband would believe such rumors. The blonde man immediately became flustered, then spilled all his friend's personality traits. Isuke just had no experience, he didn't dislike Madame, and he never cared about rumors. The blonde man cheered for Madame, saying it was the highest honor for that guy to be liked by her. Ruby didn't expect the blonde man to be so warm-hearted, although her bad mood wasn't improved by his comfort. But at least it gave her hope in winning over her husband. Making her way to the back garden, a small head peeked out from behind a rock. She was the king and queen's daughter Alien, one of the few healing angels in this world, because the queen was of slave origin. Even though she was a princess, her presence was very low. Ruby saw herself in her, so she liked her without any reason. She also had Barbie blonde hair. This brought them closer together. At this moment, Isuke's voice suddenly came from behind, startling both of them. Upon seeing her cold-faced cousin, Alien quickly thrust the flowers into Ruby's hands, then hurriedly ran away. Ruby thought he had come looking for the princess. How could that be? I came looking for you." Her usually cold husband had actually sought her out. Watching him getting closer and closer, Ruby had a bad feeling. She closed her eyes tightly. As long as husband spared her life in the future, he could do whatever he wanted now. The expected pain didn't come. Isuke rubbed his chin. "Are you expecting me to kiss you?" If she said she was expecting it, she'd probably be beaten to death. Besides, he was so fierce earlier. How dare she expect anything? "Then you still dare say you like me?" Isuke's face darkened. "Is it not allowed?" "I do like you, because you're the first person who saved me from danger." Ruby was about to run out of words. Fortunately, husband's colleague needed him for something. She secretly rejoiced at finally being free. But unexpectedly, husband told her to wait right there. This was unprecedented. She sat on the bridge admiring the golden chrysanthemums in her hands, completely unaware of the anomaly in the water. The next second, she was pulled into the lake by some force. Endless cold enveloped her. Would she die like this? What a hasty ending. She should have thought this way, but surprisingly she felt no fear at all. Husband pulled her out with one grab. People discussed in whispers. How could there be monsters in the palace? The man's gaze was cold, making Ruby inexplicably afraid. Husband wouldn't think she deliberately fell into the water, right? With experience from last time, she directly collapsed into husband's arms. She wouldn't compromise this time. She raised her voice, crying so heartbreakingly. As misfortunes never come singly, the fall into water triggered her old illness. She felt a burning pain drilling into her stomach. Since being reborn into this body, her stomach pain would attack once or twice every year. At first, father would still find doctors for her, but no doctors could find anything wrong. Father thought she was pretending to be sick to avoid marriage. That look in his eyes seemed ready to devour her. Since then, she chose to endure. Anyway, these symptoms would disappear after a few days. What a pity though. That day when husband told her to wait, what was he going to say? Such a rare opportunity must be seized. She learned husband's location from the guards. She sneaked to the window outside. Several nights were actually drinking in broad daylight. It's really not easy trying to stay alive. She had become a paparazzi. Seeing husband's arrogant manner, getting close to him was truly difficult. "Who are you talking about?" A man's voice drifted from beside her, almost scared her soul away. But this person looked familiar, seemed to be that little assistant who appeared in the palace garden that day. The little assistant felt somewhat embarrassed. He saw Madame seemed to be hiding from something, so he couldn't help but follow along. His shy appearance was just like an obedient little puppy. The two crouched down and started chatting. The little assistant didn't understand why Madame was hiding. Upon hearing Madame missed her husband, he immediately understood. He said Isuke was indeed the type who's better admired from afar than up close. This almost made Ruby burst out laughing. The little assistant actually said husband was very gentle with her. He must have had his brains knocked loose by his boss. Just as they were chatting excitedly, Isuke suddenly appeared behind them again. "Why don't you two just lie on the ground?" Ruby originally came to win over her husband, but unexpectedly got a nosebleed. This had never happened before. Both Isuke and the blonde man were very worried. She was still thinking about whether it was proper. Getting a nosebleed in front of husband was so embarrassing. Then she staggered and fell backward. Fortunately, Isuke caught her. "Why are you so hot?" Ruby couldn't believe it. Even doctors couldn't diagnose it. How did husband know? He even personally wiped her nosebleed. She had always believed this strange illness was a side effect after entering someone else's body. But husband's reaction both puzzled and amazed her. However, she really couldn't hold on anymore. Under the two men's calls, she fainted into unconsciousness. In her sleep, she suddenly heard a woman crying. Was it Aaron or some maid? She jolted awake, got out of bed wanting to investigate. But as soon as she opened the door, she ran into husband and the doctor. Let alone this situation. Why did the doctor look at her with such disgust too? She just heard someone crying, so came out to check. The two men exchanged looks, feeling very puzzled. "No one was crying," husband said seriously. But this really worried Ruby. She truly wasn't lying. "I didn't say you were lying." Husband believed her so easily. After the doctor left, Isuke saw his wife looking dizzy, then embraced her in one motion. Next, he hoisted his wife up like a bundle. At such a crucial moment, Ruby didn't forget to showcase her superb acting. "So handsome, you're truly my Prince Charming." She must really be quite ill. Isuke put her on the bed, while she still rambled on explaining that compared to Aaron, she had her own talents too. Seeing her obedient manner, Isuke didn't want to argue with her. "Then what are you good at?" Ruby looked delighted. "Acting, of course." Isuke froze, wanting to say something. But halfway through he said never mind. Ruby behind him nearly exploded in anger. He always left things unsaid. Husband completely ignored her. The sound of the door closing left her speechless. Unexpectedly, Isuke was even more speechless, to the point of hitting the wall. Not only was he stubborn with words, his head wasn't soft either. Since Ruby woke up, Aaron had taken on the responsibility of monitoring her sister-in-law. She had never seen her brother so worried before. Seeing Ruby was mostly recovered, she invited her to participate in weekend horseback riding activities. Ruby agreed without thinking. This was a good social opportunity. Last time she had made such a big joke. Everyone thought she was an insignificant person. She dressed up to appear gentle and virtuous. What she needed to do now was continue reinforcing this impression to everyone. Although it was called horseback riding activities, in reality it was just an excuse for nobles to look for potential love interests. Of course, love rival Floria wouldn't be missing. She hypocritically inquired about Ruby's health, then hugged Isuke's horse, superficially expressing joy at Ruby's recovery, but actually showing off how close Isuke's horse was to her. And her goal was achieved. Ruby couldn't help but grip her dress tightly. Now she understood why everyone said she had stolen Floria's position. Aaron seemed to notice her embarrassment. Immediately came forward to chat, letting her sister-in-law choose a horse she liked. Aaron said these horses were all very gentle, but Ruby couldn't see that at all. Even the horses discriminated against her. She already had trauma about the stables. At this time Isuke appeared again with his sour face. Hearing from Floria that his beloved wife wanted to go horseback riding, he gave her the same look as the horses. Ruby immediately started wildly praising him. "You look incredibly handsome today too." Isuke turned his head away, somewhat speechless, saying today was his day off and he had nothing to do. Ruby asked if he wanted to go riding together. He arrogantly said he was very busy. What a changeable person. Aaron knew what her brother was worried about. The doctor said horseback riding would be fine. Then she led the horse, wanting to take Floria away, making space for her brother and sister-in-law. But Floria seemed reluctant to leave. Under Aaron's urging, the whole stable was left with just Ruby and Isuke. Seeing the only attendant nearby, Isuke sent him away too, watching that person's hurriedly fleeing figure. Ruby's fear came flooding back. This was a good chance to get closer, but her body uncontrollably dropped to its knees. "I'm sorry, I was wrong, I'm ungrateful, I'm beyond saving." Isuke's brows furrowed tightly. He picked up the riding crop from the ground, feeling indescribable emotions, then forcefully threw the crop far behind him. She didn't understand why this woman brought the whip. Seeing husband unhappy, Ruby became more terrified. "If I brought the wrong thing, I can go back and get it right away." "Get it to do what to you?" Isuke's furrowed brows deepened further. Ruby lay on the ground breaking out in cold sweat. "I know I did wrong." Isuke could hardly communicate normally with her. What exactly had this woman been through? She told the woman to shut up, but Ruby couldn't hear anything. "Shut up." Isuke pulled her up in one motion. At this moment, Ruby finally came to her senses. She thought acting had become easy for her, but in this stable, the childhood trauma of being abused by her family always controlled her body. Just now Isuke was teaching her how to get close to horses. He told her to bring over something nearby, but she reflexively grabbed the riding crop. When she saw the apple that husband had brought over, Ruby finally understood. It was all husband's fault for not being clear. She had been so scared. She fed the apple to husband's horse, muttering for the horse to be nice to her. Isuke stared at her with eyes full of confusion and some heartache, so he decided to share a horse with his wife. Both Ruby and the attendant were very surprised. They rode the same horse. This situation shocked everyone even more. The cold duke who never approached women had actually changed. Everyone's gaze was astonished, but in Ruby's eyes these gazes were full of darkness. She knew without looking that husband's expression must be full of killing intent now. And as soon as Isuke dismounted, he started arguing with his sister Aaron. The cause of their argument was Ruby. Aaron was very unhappy. "How was I supposed to know your new wife couldn't go to such places? I'm not trying to blame you. Then how do you want me?" Aaron turned her head, questioning why brother's attitude was so inconsistent. Seeing the two arguing intensely, Ruby sat restlessly. Floria couldn't listen anymore either. She pulled the two apart. "Rather than arguing here, why not take your wife around more?" Only then did Isuke remember his wife still on horseback. While Ruby was hesitating how to dismount, a hand pulled her. Then she crashed straight into husband's embrace. Heart-fluttering moment lasted just an instant. "Stop fighting." She looked pitiful and vulnerable. She really admired her own superb acting, but didn't notice the eyes staring intently at her from the side. Isuke, who usually stayed away from women, being so public with his wife today. This inevitably made some people jealous, like the blonde woman who had pursued him before. She was always speaking with hidden barbs, trying to embarrass Ruby. But Ruby didn't take the bait. Instead, she played dumb and tried to befriend the blonde woman. The atmosphere became somewhat awkward. At this point, Floria very timely said, "Let's go riding together. Actually, Miss Sora isn't bad, she just likes Isuke too much." Floria defended the blonde woman, telling Ruby not to be angry. She hadn't expected the new wife to be so skilled at riding. She pointed at the path ahead. "Let's see who's better." Ruby immediately became spirited. This was a good chance to get close to Floria. So with Floria's yielding, she set off first. Leaves danced in the gentle breeze. That was the scent of freedom. No need to watch others' expressions, no need to act. At this moment she was just herself. She was about to unleash her full power and fight it out. But when she turned back to call Floria, there was no one behind. mind. She was puzzled. Then that familiar black mist attacked again, then suddenly wrapped around her foot. The horse was instantly startled. She was thus entangled by the black mist and dragged deeper. When she woke up again, she lay alone in the forest. Before she could react, strange rustling sounds came from behind. A monster with green eyes and long ears, looking like a big dumpling. Ruby was quite scared. Was this a raccoon or a rabbit? The monster suddenly opened its huge mouth. Inside was filled with white bones. Who wouldn't be scared seeing this? Ruby's heart was in her throat. The monster flapped its two short arms, then approached Ruby. Next it suddenly hugged Ruby. Ruby struggled and screamed desperately, thinking she would die here today. But the next second, the monster closed its terrifying mouth. It seemed to have seen something. It took Ruby to hide behind a large rock. Under the silver moonlight's cover, strange sounds kept coming. Ruby curiously peeked out, wanting to see what was happening, but was pushed down by the monster. The sound of horse hooves gradually became clearer. Ruby felt very uneasy. Instinct told her she absolutely couldn't make any sound. When she saw what was before her eyes, she almost cried out. A knight holding a head in his hand, with black mist constantly seeping from his neck, rode a horse seeming to search for prey everywhere. He stopped in front of where Ruby and the monster were hiding. The intense pressure made it impossible to breathe. Fortunately, he finally rode away gradually. Ruby finally let out a sigh of relief. She turned to look at the monster. That black mist appeared again. She could no longer care about the intense pain in her body. Just as she wondered what that thing was, a leaf was patted onto the bleeding spot on her head. Only then did she realize the monster was saving her, and it could understand human speech. It could only understand her words. She asked the monster to help her one more time. She wanted to go home but couldn't find the way back. The monster's dejected expression was so cute, probably sad to part with Ruby. But it still turned its back and waved its short arms, gesturing for Ruby to ride on. Ruby grabbed its big ears, which felt soft and comfortable. She obediently lay on the monster's back. "I'm ready." The monster immediately took a leap, carrying her up into the sky. Meanwhile, Iskai discovered his wife was missing and searched the mountains with his men. But when he found Ruby, he was full of blame, believing women were nothing but trouble, and advised her not to try attracting his attention with such tricks. His words were like knives, cutting Ruby with terror. Her voice trembled even as she apologized. This time she cried from genuine hurt. Iskai had a sharp tongue but soft heart. He couldn't bear to see this woman cry. Then he scooped his wife up in his arms. "Forget it, let's go home for treatment first." Ruby couldn't understand why this man was so fickle. Though he was fierce, his embrace was addictively warm. Without realizing it, she fell asleep. When she next opened her eyes, she was back in their room. Her husband had been waiting, wanting to hear her reasonable explanation. This was quite unexpected. Ruby explained that Freya had initially suggested horseback riding. Then she encountered monsters on the way. She told him everything but hid her encounter with Monster Bubble. Iskai clearly didn't believe her, because Freya told him Ruby was stubborn and wouldn't listen, insisting on wandering deep into the forest. Ruby's eyes widened in disbelief. She had seemed so friendly earlier. How could she change so suddenly? Was she afraid of taking responsibility, or did she want me dead? The original story revolved around the male and female leads, without much introduction to Freya. Only known as a popular and capable noblewoman, Ruby's mind was in chaos. "You should go back." Her husband suggested divorce at this moment. He was willing to let Ruby leave unconditionally. This was completely unexpected for Ruby. Though they would divorce someday, it definitely shouldn't be now. If she left, no one could stop her brother from harming Aaron. Just thinking of her brother's cold face made her uncontrollably afraid. Her husband was still telling her to go home beside her. She wouldn't go back. In her shock, she knocked over the bedside lamp. She knelt down, clutching her husband's pant leg. "I can't go back." Tears covered her whole face. "It's all my fault. You can punish me however you want." She desperately begged for her husband's forgiveness. Just like what happened in the stable earlier that day. Iskai gritted his teeth in anger, but he wavered. He grabbed Ruby's shoulders. "You're really driving me crazy. You might as well act high and mighty like a princess." He shouted nearly hysterically. Why did he have to care about this woman's life or death? He had almost gone mad trying to find out why his wife disappeared. Ruby had never seen her husband like this, but one thing was certain. That was that he cared about her. Though she knew this was a place of 99 deaths and 1 life. She still thought everything would be fine if she didn't follow the original story's path. Unexpectedly, Freya, who had shown her no hostility, became the first person who wanted her dead. Early the next morning, Freya came to apologize. She said she was too scared to tell the truth. Ruby saw through all her tricks. But now wasn't the time to strike back. She was completely outmatched by Freya. Moreover, no one here would believe her words. After all, she was a foreigner with a notorious past. After that day, she never saw her husband again, and he warned her to stay obediently at home. Aaron resumed monitoring her 3 daily meals. But since she was busy with her brother's birthday celebration, she assigned the head maid to look after her sister-in-law. However, the maids were all opportunists. They barely took care of her. Though it was annoying, she still needed to prepare her husband's birthday gift. She wanted to make an embroidery by hand. But the head maid suddenly appeared like a ghost. Hearing that the madame hadn't decided what to embroider, she very kindly suggested embroidering a willow tree. She said the young master often climbed willow trees as a child, but that tree was gone now, and he always regretted its loss. Ruby gratefully thanked her for the suggestion. But she wasn't foolish enough to embroider a willow tree. It was clearly a trap. In the original story, Iskai's mother had hanged herself on a willow tree. So it was confirmed, the head maid had been trying to harm her all along. After staying up all night, she finally finished her work, golden daisies symbolizing happiness. She wanted to give it to her husband personally. But her old illness struck at just this moment. Intense pain surged through her stomach. The head maid brought bad news, saying the young master wouldn't let Madame attend the banquet. Seeing Madame unwell, she offered to deliver the embroidery to Iskai on her behalf. Ruby would be stupid to give it to her. She didn't believe the head maid's words. She couldn't just lie in bed letting others bully her. She called for the maid Lucy. Lucy had accepted her favors before. She used the same trick again, secretly slipping her a gemstone. With Lucy's help, she successfully escaped. She hid in the bushes by the banquet entrance, just waiting for her husband to appear. But the weather wasn't cooperative, thunder rumbled and rain poured down. She was soaked like a drowned rat. The prepared gift was also wet. She didn't dare enter, hiding at the hall entrance. The banquet inside was lively. Freya even gave Iskai a sparkling purple gemstone. Ruby looked at her wrinkled embroidery. She quietly closed the door. She could never enter that world. If she went in, she could only imagine embarrassing herself. As she prepared to leave, she was almost knocked flying again. Whoever it was, she just wanted to quickly leave. But that person called out to her, "Madam, are you unwell?" Hearing that voice, Ruby knew it was Roland. "Just scold me directly," she had self-awareness. No need to insult me with songs like last time. These overly direct words left Roland stunned. Ruby sniffled pathetically. But when she turned around, she was startled. 3 men were staring intently at her. Ruby felt mortified. If her husband got angry at her for sneaking out, wouldn't that be even more embarrassing? But at least she didn't want to stay in front of Freya's brother, so she turned to flee. Yet she stepped on her dress hem and fell down. This was utterly humiliating. Iskai held her. "What am I going to do with you?" Ruby perfectly misunderstood her husband's meaning again, repeatedly apologizing, saying she shouldn't have come out. Iskai looked completely puzzled. Ruby was aggrieved. "I know you don't allow yourself to attend the party, but I still want to send the gift over." "What exactly are you talking about?" Hearing her husband's question, she finally realized the head maid had been causing trouble. Her face instantly bloomed into a smile. Iskai finally showed a tender expression, though caring words still wouldn't come out. The blonde man pulled Roland's ear saying, "I warned you last time not to sing such songs." Iskai turned his head. "What songs?" Ruby became extremely nervous. Though she wanted to see Roland get scolded, she cared more about her husband's feelings. So she pretended to sneeze. Iskai immediately held his wife tightly. "Are you all right?" They had been married for 3 years yet had never shared a bed. This had infuriated the old duke. Even his daughter knew it was her brother's issue. But he blamed his daughter-in-law for not fulfilling her duties. Ruby could understand. After all, with her disgraceful past, the duke only agreed to this marriage to cure his son's stubborn abstinence. Once they became true husband and wife, Ruby's country would have no reason to break the marriage. So he hoped his daughter-in-law would soon be with his son. This was also what Ruby wanted. This way, if her brother wanted to break the marriage, he would have to pay a heavy price. The plan to assassinate Aaron would inevitably be delayed. Perhaps Iskai would also no longer want to send her away because of the trouble. The duke's idea was quite perfect. But the question was, how could she win over her husband? Thinking back to the birthday banquet, her husband wasn't just gentle. He also took her to the banquet hall. She met Princess Alien and the blonde knight's sister. The 3 of them had great fun together. Iskai suddenly appeared behind her. Seeing her crouching on the ground, he extended his hand. For the first time, Ruby truly felt her husband's kindness. She took out her prepared embroidery, offering her blessing. Hearing his wife say she had stayed up all night to embroider, Iskai was startled. He slowly accepted it. There was even an attached letter of reflection. The letter in his hand grew tighter. "Are you silly?" Her husband showed that gentle expression again. He said he really liked her gift. So early the next morning, she brought fruit to her husband's training ground. Her husband looked cool while sparring with others. Even the sweat sliding down his cheeks looked crystal clear. He was simply too handsome. Ruby and the young assistant cheered from the side. Iskai turned back with another death glare. The young assistant got beaten up by the blonde man for slacking off. So noisy, Iskai wiped his sweat with an impatient face. Hearing his wife praise his handsomeness, he walked to the side and sat down, casually grabbed an apple and started eating, watching her husband's sweat drops sliding down his neck. Ruby instinctively reached out to wipe them. But her husband looked at her warily. It's filthy. Ruby didn't understand, she had just washed her hands before coming. This nearly drove Iskai crazy. He wasn't saying she was filthy. Ruby sighed heavily, this man was truly mercurial. Although their relationship had improved after the birthday banquet, Iskai still seemed difficult to get close to. When she thick-skinnedly brought up the Duke, the atmosphere instantly became more tense. Just thinking about having to speak about such things made her want to cry. She indirectly expressed wanting an angel's love. Her husband became even more disdainful. While searching through the fruit, he complained about his wife's poor thinking. Ruby hesitated for a long time. She obliquely conveyed the Duke's meaning. Unexpectedly, her husband couldn't understand. With no choice, Ruby had to embarrassingly ask him for their first night. Her husband told her not to mind the Duke's words. Just do as she pleased. But for Ruby, this was a matter of life and death. And she really didn't want to go home. She confessed emotionally that she only wanted to stay by her husband's side. Iskai stood up looking at her. If you change your mind now, there's still time. I absolutely won't change my mind. Seeing his wife so determined, Iskai turned and left, saying, then see you tonight. But nothing happened between them that night. To prevent her from being bullied. Even though nothing happened between them last night, her husband still invited her to have breakfast together, and said they must eat lunch and dinner together from now on. He would also take her to the temple at noon. Everything was developing in a good direction. It's just that last night's opportunity was wasted. She felt unsatisfied. Next time she would definitely take the initiative. But at this time, someone who shouldn't have appeared came again. Freya pretended to be full of joy. Though clearly here to pick a fight, she said she came to see her bishop granduncle. She even brought her brother and a group of knights, instantly making the atmosphere awkward. At this moment, footsteps approached. Roland's group completely lost their previous arrogance. They hurriedly stood at attention, terrified. Ruby looked confused. Her husband suddenly appeared. You're late. He asked about the flower crown in his wife's hands. Ruby instantly beamed with joy, saying she made it specially for him. Iskai complained, while still showing concern about his wife's dirty hands. Seeing the couple's casual interaction, Freya felt extremely uncomfortable. After hesitating for a moment, she put her hand on Iskai's shoulder again, appearing carefree while joking, but actually trying to show intimacy in front of Ruby. When she brought up Roland, Iskai's expression darkened. Freya continued speaking on her own, saying her brother had offended Madame before, so today they came to sincerely apologize. But Ruby didn't believe it. Why should she accept an insincere apology? Ruby flicked her hair. What are you talking about? I don't understand at all. This caught the siblings off guard. But Freya wasn't just anyone, she was excellent at playing pure and innocent. She said hearing Roland's words made her feel heartbroken for Madame. But Ruby didn't take it to heart at all. Freya's mouth twitched. Roland immediately stepped forward, insisting on apologizing no matter what. Ruby really wanted to slap him twice. But with her husband present, it was impossible for her to be wronged. One look from Iskai scared Roland into hiding behind his sister. Hearing his wife say it was nothing, he bent down again. Are you really all right? The sudden concern scared Ruby into a cold sweat, her tongue tied in knots. Iskai pressed his hand to her forehead, thinking his wife must be sick. Freya stood to the side, reluctant to leave, saying, could it be from the cold wind? Madame has always been delicate. But Iskai completely ignored her. He directly took his wife into his arms, then turned to leave, only leaving these words, remember to come apologize properly next time, then disappeared from the siblings' sight. Freya chewed her fingers in anger. What was that woman anyway? Why did everyone protect her? And how could Ruby miss such a rare opportunity? She directly kissed her husband's cheek. But when she turned her head, she was mortified. A group of white-robed priests were shocked. She had done such a thing in such a sacred place. Ruby was dying of embarrassment. They hadn't come to the temple for so long that the high priest was worried something was wrong. Now it seemed he had worried unnecessarily. Ruby was speechless. As everyone knows, I don't stick to traditions. Iskai clearly wanted to protect his wife. But hearing the high priest direct blame toward his wife, he changed his tone, saying it was just a joke, pulling his wife close. He said they hadn't come to the temple because his wife wasn't feeling well, believing it wouldn't be long before they visited again, meaning it wouldn't be long before they had children. For a moment, both men wore smiles but were actually competing. Looking at those high priest's sour faces, it was clear they greatly disliked Iskai. After all, he was the king's nephew. The temple and royal family had long been at odds. In a few days, the temple would hold a charity event, and the high priest invited Ruby to attend. Iskai directly blocked his wife, saying he would attend too. Though the high priest was very unwilling, he couldn't refuse. Soon it was the day of the event. Ruby had wanted to chat alone with her husband. But as soon as he appeared, he was surrounded by people. That's when the high priest found her. The high priest had actually been looking forward to the princess's arrival. When he was young and stranded in Romana, unable to return home. It was the Pope's monastery that took him in. Though Ruby was mentally prepared. If this person was a family spy, it would indeed be a troublesome matter. But this wasn't the only worry. Freya had also attended the event. There were many fine paintings here. They were the Duke's favorites, and Freya suggested Ruby buy one as a gift for her father-in-law. Though it was a good idea. Coming from her mouth, it wasn't necessarily so well-intentioned. Most importantly, Ruby was poor. And she didn't understand paintings. Freya continued with feigned enthusiasm, saying Romana was famous for its paintings. Erin quickly changed the subject, saying she had discussed with her brother. They planned to find a maid for her sister-in-law with no family connections. Since Freya's mother had extensive connections, Erin entrusted this task to her. Ruby was internally against it. But this was also a good opportunity to find help. Freya was very enthusiastic. But things gradually went wrong. She suddenly coughed up blood in front of everyone. Then fainted unconscious on the ground. Ruby rushed over immediately. Seeing Freya struggling to cough blood, Ruby couldn't help but empathize. But her husband suddenly pushed her away. She was stunned. "Get out." Her husband's harsh rebuke left her hand frozen in midair. She had never seen her husband so anxious. Looking at the blood on her sleeve, she trembled uncontrollably. In her previous life, the only sister who loved her also fell in front of her like today. "It was you, it must have been you." Hearing Roland's accusation, Ruby finally realized she'd been made the culprit. Only the blonde knight Ivan was concerned about Madame, searching everywhere for Ruby. When he saw this scene, just as he was about to teach that crazy boy a lesson, someone beat Roland and knocked him to the ground. It was Roland's father. Bowing 90 degrees, he apologized to Ruby for his son's rudeness. However, one wave hadn't settled before another arose. Thunder suddenly struck in the sky. Monsters had broken into the temple. Ruby helplessly hugged herself. She felt sick with nausea. Fortunately, the blood-stained sleeve was quickly torn away by Ivan. At this point, she hadn't realized just how dangerous that was. In the chaos caused by the monsters, the temple had become complete mayhem. By the time it ended, most of the day had passed. Fortunately, Freya's life wasn't in danger. The servant who brought the wine had vanished. The only clue left was the source of the poison. It was a liquid from a certain stone. This stone was a holy relic, only the Pope's office with permission could produce it. So as the Pope's daughter, Ruby became the prime suspect behind it all. Hearing the Duke's analysis, Ruby understood no one would believe she was innocent. But the Duke surprisingly said he believed her. Because Ruby was his daughter-in-law. Ruby buried her head in her arms, utterly at a loss for words. Everyone said she poisoned Freya out of jealousy. Seeing her cry so sadly, the Duke felt helpless. He was also afraid of women crying, so he quickly took out his handkerchief. He repeatedly stated his position. Whoever dared to falsely accuse his daughter-in-law was insulting the entire Omida family. So please stop crying. Though Ruby was touched, she also clearly understood her situation. Now there were several possibilities in Freya's poisoning incident. Either it was revenge against their family, or it was done by Romana. The biggest suspect was her perverted brother. Because he worried she would develop feelings for this place, so he orchestrated everything. Thinking of this, Ruby felt desperate. Thinking of how her husband looked at her. It was still etched in her mind. Perhaps Iskai already regretted being so kind to her recently. Her mind was already in chaos, and her old illness struck again. She wanted to drink some water to ease it, but discovered the water had been tampered with. The discomfort in her throat made her cough continuously. She suddenly felt envious of Freya. At least when she was sick, she had so many family and friends around her. Erin suddenly appeared behind her at this moment. Before she could react, she was pressed against the wall. "Why don't you just die?" After enduring torment through 2 lifetimes, she had developed an eating disorder. Due to habitual vomiting, her index finger bore bite marks. This secret even her family hadn't discovered, yet in just a few months with her sister-in-law. The sister-in-law suspected something the first time she saw her hand. So, whenever she had the chance, she would make Ruby eat more. "Are you doing this to get attention, or are you afraid the Duke family's food will dirty your mouth? If you want to die, just do it quietly," Erin screamed hysterically. "Because this is the only thing I can control." The air instantly froze. Ruby's answer made her realize her own impropriety. "What's wrong with me? I'm sorry." She hurriedly turned and left, leaving Ruby standing there bewildered. Because of Freya's poisoning, the high priest wanted to see her. She came to the temple alone. Though she had just been here recently, it felt like several autumns had passed. While lost in thought, she overheard people arguing. It was Roland and Andy. The two were actually arguing about Ruby. Roland was very unhappy. His sister had nearly died coughing blood. Yet Andy said Ruby was innocent, and asked him to go home and sleep. He was very angry. Flirting with my brother while trying to steal men from my sister, shameless. Andy grabbed his clothes, wanting to punch him twice, but Roland had reached a point of no return. If he saw that woman again, he would definitely tear apart her ugly face. Every word was unbearable. Ruby hugged her head, unsure if she was heartbroken or scared. So someone already hated her to such an extent. Waves of dizziness came over her. She was so tired. She crouched in the bushes, just wanting to stay quiet. But what then? Where else could she go? Was there anywhere left in this world for her? Her body hurt, her heart hurt too. She had originally just wanted to play her role well, to live properly until the end. But Iskai's kindness towards her, his trust in her, how he protected her. She started to hope that this man was different from others. While she was feeling dejected, a familiar voice suddenly came. It was Monster Bubble who had come to find her. Seeing Bubble specially come to find her, Ruby felt both touched and grieved. She felt terrible now but was happy to see Bubble. Her nose started bleeding again. Bubble felt distressed. Quickly reached out, ready to carry Ruby on its back and elope. Ruby was initially somewhat worried. But thinking of what just happened, she smiled. Everyone probably couldn't wait for her to disappear. Perhaps leaving like this was right. And that man she cared about by now had gone 3 days and nights without sleep, his handsome face haggard. His good friend was nearly worried to death. If this continued, the murderer might not be found before Iskai died first. Ivan knew that the poison person wasn't just anyone, but his childhood friend Freya. Iskai denied this. He didn't know why he was like this. After Freya woke up, she kept saying strange things to him, still intimately pulling at him. His mind was in chaos, unable to think clearly. Remembering how Ruby looked at him that day, those lifeless eyes were deeply etched in his mind. If the monsters hadn't been driven back that day, or if even a drop of Freya's poisoned blood had splashed onto Ruby, he dared not imagine the consequences. That's why he had urgently pushed her away. Everything I did was for you, you should understand, right? A colleague rushed over in panic. Iskai, your wife has disappeared. Meanwhile, Ruby woke up in a cave. She was nearly scared to death. A huge eagle was eating not far away. Ruby had originally planned to play dead. But with a plop, a horse leg fell right in front of her, with 2 flies buzzing around it. Ruby was completely speechless. Her scream echoed throughout the mountain. Bubble anxiously ran back, seeing the scene before him. It was furious, shouting while throwing the horse leg to the eagle. They argued for quite a while before Ruby realized they were friends. Hearing Ruby's voice, Bubble immediately turned around, then handed over the blueberries he had picked. Ruby paused. If she didn't eat them, Bubble would be sad, right? She chewed slowly, seeing the 2 little cuties' expectant faces. She gave a thumbs up in approval. The eagle and Bubble immediately hugged each other in joy. Though somewhat exaggerated, it was really cute. In the blink of an eye, Ruby had been missing for 4 days. Iskai still hadn't found her. Since finding that shoe in the area, he had turned the whole mountain upside down. His heart was now like this continuous rainy weather. Iskai went 3 days and nights without eating or drinking, without sleep, torturing himself into this ghost-like state, single-mindedly wanting to solve the case quickly to clear his wife's name. Even if this matter was really related to his wife, it didn't matter. He would handle it without hesitation. He always felt that even without saying it, his wife would understand. But reality had slapped him in the face. Someone who usually traveled with many attendants had disappeared for half a day without anyone noticing. Who should he blame? Blame the high priest who invited Ruby to the temple? Blame Aaron, who was completely focused on Freya? Or blame Freya, who kept demanding Aaron's company? But the true culprit was himself. He was wrong. He had never doubted the servant's loyalty, especially the head maid who loved Aaron like a daughter. But he had never thought his wife's arrival would make her everyone's thorn in the flesh. On his birthday, he learned the head maid had deceived Ruby on her own accord. But out of her loyalty, Iskai had forgiven her. Now he realized how ridiculous his mistake was. He should have corrected things right then. He had always rejected marriage, not wanting to become a jerk like his father. But unknowingly, he had already become someone like his father. His coldness had created the current situation. Now it was too late to say anything. He knew what the knights had left unsaid. Your wife is dead, she can't be found. But he didn't want to give up. At least not until he saw her remains. He felt unprecedented helplessness. He prayed to his deceased mother, praying his wife was still alive. But he couldn't even remember his mother's face clearly. That night when he shared a bed with his wife, he had seen his wife's vulnerability. If all this disappeared, what would he do alone? On the other side, Ruby was living happily in the depths of the forest. Bubble and the eagle stayed by her side. Other monsters occasionally came to observe. She instantly became a tourist attraction in the forest. Moreover, Bubble's friends often came to forage. Their bouncing around was extremely cute. Whether it was because of herself, or the innate affinity of this body's original owner, she could genuinely feel these monsters were all friendly to her. Just wondering what Iskai was doing. Did he know she was gone? Perhaps even if he knew, he would just make a perfunctory search for appearance's sake. Look how pathetic she was, really didn't know what she was expecting. Her every move was noticed by Bubble. It ran over to pull at Ruby's sighing face. Then pulled at its own face too, wanting her to be happier. Ruby grinned, is that so? It seems nice here too, why don't I just live here with you all? Anyway, I'm just disliked if I go back. Bubble drooped its long ears, once again reaching out its pitifully short arms, embracing Ruby. Instantly, warmth washed over her. Thank you. Ruby really enjoyed this tender moment. But the weather was uncooperative. In the blink of an eye, rain started drizzling. Ruby urged everyone back to the cave. Yes, where else could she escape to? If she ran away with a full purse, she'd probably be robbed before even setting out. If she hid in a convent, her perverted brother would find her quickly. Though this place wasn't exactly easy either. At least she had Bubble and the eagle accompanying her. Her mind was in chaos, not noticing the path beneath her feet. She stepped into empty air. She fell down. Looking around, it was pitch black. Bubble and the eagle jumped down after her. They first checked if Ruby was okay. But it was so dark here, nothing could be seen clearly. Ruby was extremely worried. But cheers came from behind. This place was actually full of various red rubies. This was simply striking it rich. Ruby's jaw hadn't closed since the shock. With such a mine, going from riding a bicycle to a motorcycle, becoming a world-class rich woman wasn't just a dream. In her excitement, she noticed something even more dazzling than the jewels nearby. Driven by curiosity, she reached out to touch it. But the moment she made contact, that thing seemed to move. With a rumbling sound, a huge creature emerged from the ground. What on earth was this thing? Ruby started bowing frantically to it, saying they really just fell in by accident, begging the monster to spare them. The monster also looked confused, its mouth continuously emitting thousand-year-old breath. With a swing of its tail, it swept Ruby into the air. Now she was really going to die. Meanwhile, Iskai was looking utterly dejected. At this moment, the knights caught two hunters. They said they saw a witch in a cave. They had originally planned to go back for help, but then saw an eagle. They were so scared they ran away. The knights thought they were talking about a banshee, but they insisted repeatedly, saying what they saw was definitely a witch. Iskai immediately wanted to go without another word. The knights all thought the poacher's words couldn't be trusted. After all, that place was a restricted area. Even if it were true, it might not be madam. Iskai wouldn't listen to any of it. If anyone's tired, just leave. But after saying this, he realized he had gone mad. Living people who entered that forest rarely came out alive. The reason he only brought so few people was because he couldn't trust anyone else. Whether it was the unprecedented frequent monster appearances, or Ruby repeatedly being at the center of incidents with accumulating suspicions, made him start to be certain. As they gradually went deeper into the forest, Ivan still called out to stop Iskai, saying they had reached near the Ram cave. He had a bad feeling. But before he could finish speaking, a series of roars split the sky, followed by a woman's scream. Meanwhile in the cave, Ruby was hanging upside down in midair by the dragon. Bubble and the eagle were frantic, one gnawing at the dragon's leg, the other poking at the dragon's face. But the dragon's skin was too thick, and it was only interested in Ruby. Ruby couldn't open her eyes from the thousand-year breath, thinking she was about to die. Unexpectedly, the next second, her feet gently touched the ground. What was going on now? Could this creature understand what she was saying? Taking advantage while the dragon wasn't paying attention, she quietly tried to sneak away. But she had barely moved when she was surrounded by the dragon's tail again. The dragon roared at her. What do you want? Are you playing with me? Ruby snorted coldly. Will you let me go or not? The dragon wouldn't back down either, opening its mouth to show its sharp teeth. This nearly scared her to death. Jewels clattered to the ground. She really couldn't understand what the dragon wanted to do. Suddenly, a short hand quickly lifted her into the air. It was the eagle and Bubble. They fled toward the cave entrance. The dragon chased relentlessly behind. That was close. They had barely escaped. They sat on the ground still terrified. That dragon was simply too scary. Cold snowflakes fell on her face. Ruby was mesmerized. She closed her eyes to enjoy this rare snowy scene. All along she had lived carefully watching others' faces. She couldn't even remember when she last saw snow. Suddenly, a familiar voice came from behind. It can't be him. She kept denying while turning around. How could you be here? Perseverance pays off. He finally found her. Looking at the two fierce monsters, Iskai's first instinct was to worry about his wife's safety, drawing his sword to protect her. But Ruby's response left him stunned. Please don't come closer, I beg you. Not only did Ruby refuse him, but she also begged him not to help her. He opened and closed his mouth wanting to explain, but didn't know what to say. Get away from me, Ruby used all her strength. Then fled from her husband's presence. She wanted to just disappear. Her past life had left her scarred beyond measure. Even after crossing over to this world, the pain of living made her unable to distinguish truth from fiction. She foolishly hoped she could have family here, that someone would love her. However, reality rarely meets expectations. Let her stay here and fend for herself. Running too hastily, her foot slipped and she stumbled to the ground. Tears mixed with white snow. The snowy day was cold, but not as cold as her frozen heart. At this moment, the familiar roar came again. The giant dragon appeared before her eyes once more. Looking at its glowing green eyes, Ruby no longer felt her previous fear. Rather than lingering here in misery, she might as well end it all. She slowly closed her eyes. And her reaction deeply pained Iskai's heart. Although in their previous meetings she was always full of lies, always talking nonsense. But at least whenever she looked at Iskai, she did so with a bright smile. If he had said those words earlier, would the outcome have been different? Yes, he should have asked earlier. Every time he saw Ruby suffering, he wanted to ask what she had been through. Why did she fear him so much yet desperately try to stay by his side? But he never had the heart to ask. Until just now when she pushed him away. He was stunned and dazed. Just as his thoughts were in chaos, that terrifying roar passed overhead. Could the dragon have grabbed the madam in its claws? The knights had barely finished speaking when Iskai rushed out. Although there was still much he didn't understand, he still couldn't abandon her. Ruby slowly opened her eyes. This soft sensation startled her heart. The dragon was staring at her very gently. What was going on? Why am I still alive? Why didn't the dragon eat me? She reached out her hand, stroking the dragon's large nose bridge. You might as well eat me now. Her eyes were full of desolation. The words might as well eat her caught in her throat. The dragon seemed to sense her sadness and moved closer to her face, letting out low rumbles. Ruby could feel the dragon was trying to comfort her. But she was very worried about Bubble and the eagle. She even apologized to the dragon on their behalf. After all, they were just trying to save her. Suddenly a sharp pain shot through her. She lifted her skirt, only to see her foot was red and swollen. It must have been sprained when she fell earlier. With a plop, a glowing blue mushroom fell in front of her. It was quite pretty. Looking at the dragon's eye expression. Are you telling me to use it on the injury? The dragon nodded satisfactorily. Ruby lay on its thigh. This dragon was really strange. And wasn't she even stranger? Thank you so much. Is this where you chose to hide? Iskai appeared at the cave entrance with his sword. Those eyes looked like they could devour someone. In that instant, Ruby's fear of him surged through her whole body again. Iskai walked into the cave silently. Sensing danger, the dragon let out a roar. This really angered Iskai. After kidnapping his wife, it had the nerve to roar at him. He raised his sword ready to duel. Ruby was terrified. But she was more afraid the dragon would get hurt because of her. She gripped the mushroom tighter and tighter. Stop, you stop right there. The mushroom hit Iskai hard in the face. While the physical damage wasn't much, it dealt 10,000 points of psychological damage. Iskai covered his face cursing, damn it, but his body was swaying unsteadily. Ruby froze in place. What had he done? It would be terrible if Iskai got even angrier. She quickly apologized, saying it wasn't intentional. The dragon was baring its teeth behind her, still refusing to calm down. No, you stop too. She shook her head at the dragon. She didn't want Iskai to get hurt either. Fortunately, the dragon was obedient and quieted down. She finally breathed a sigh of relief. Looking at the stumbling Iskai, she wondered if she had thrown the mushroom too hard. Why wasn't Iskai moving, and why did he look like he would fall over if pushed? Ruby didn't know why either. Seeing her husband's sharp gaze, should she first explain that she didn't poison Freya, or first deny that she tried to run away? But what good would saying more do? This man would never believe her. Even so, she didn't want her husband to misunderstand her. She hadn't poisoned anyone, and wasn't a witch controlling monsters. I really didn't do anything. Tears sprayed forth. She felt extremely wronged. She really hadn't meant to run away. When she was suffering, it was those monsters who saved her. She begged her husband not to hurt those little ones and not to send her back to her family. She was prepared to accept punishment. "I won't," Iskai reached out, crouching down and gently caressing her cheek. His gentle gaze was full of heartache, softly comforting his wife not to cry. He took out the shoes he had picked up along the way, then lifted his wife's foot to put the shoe on her. "I won't let anyone call you a witch." Looking at Ruby's swollen foot, he felt indescribable feelings. "I was wrong." Though the words were few, touched Ruby's heart. The man before her felt like a stranger. Wasn't Iskai always annoyed by her causing trouble, detesting her deeply? He should have wished for her disappearance more than anyone. What had caused this change in her husband? While she was lost in thought, Iskai reached out his hand again. "Come home with me." This was something she never expected. She glanced at the dragon beside her, only to see it secretly giving her a knowing look. Ruby understood, that's right, she was human. How could she live here? So she reached for her husband's hand. Her racing heartbeat echoed throughout the valley. At this moment, Iskai finally dared to hold her tight. He let out a long breath. "Everything's all right now." These words seemed more like comfort for himself than for Ruby. He had really almost lost her. The warmth of his palm and his gentle words made Ruby feel a warmth she had never experienced before. All her gloom turned to tears in that instant. The dancing snowflakes dispersed with them. Waiting for her would be the warm spring sun. Meanwhile, the reason Aaron could spot Ruby's signs of purging at a glance was because her mother, in the year of her death, had also been pathologically obsessed with external beauty. Until her death, her mother had maintained her slender figure through purging. Every time Aaron went to see her, she would grab her daughter and ask if she looked ugly. Realizing her extreme behavior, she would then constantly apologize to her daughter. But she still didn't want anyone to know about her condition. If so, she would rather die. The once noble Duchess had now become like this. Aaron didn't understand. Even now, only she and a few servants knew about her mother's condition. That's why she got so emotional when she discovered the scars on Ruby's hands. The Duchess's experience reminded Ruby of her sister from her previous life. She was the only one who had been kind to her. Her sister's experience was very similar to the Duchess's, and having been raised by her sister, she was inevitably influenced. "Please don't tell my husband," she didn't want him to know. But that wasn't the most important thing right now. Because the frost dragon that had slept for 1,000 years had awakened. The whole empire was on high alert. But preparations had been made to deal with it. Aaron reassured her sister-in-law, telling her not to be too afraid, but also not to run away alone again. During the days Ruby was missing, she had been very worried. Her brother said they found sister-in-law near the frost forest. And it was the self-defense force that discovered her. Her brother was now discussing a reward with them in gratitude. Ruby became more and more confused as she listened. She had awakened the frost dragon, and her husband had personally led the search for her. Yet he hadn't mentioned a word of this to others. She didn't understand why her husband did this. Even Iskai himself wasn't clear. This raised suspicions from his uncle the emperor. If it had been before, considering the interests of both countries, Iskai would have already put that woman on a ship back home. But for these 4 days he had turned the capital upside down looking for her. "She is the Pope's daughter. And also your wife." Emperor Uncle understood his nephew's thoughts very well. After all, he had been through it himself, whether out of duty or whatever reason. Once emotions get involved, the result is often regret. Iskai couldn't listen to any of it. His uncle was nagging just like Aaron. He turned away and went to seek advice from the knight's commander. "Does your wife also run away from home?" The commander was taken aback, surprise filling his one eye. Iskai had come in with a worried face. So this was what was troubling him. He coughed twice to ease the awkwardness. "Rather than running away, it's more like going back to her parents' home." "Is your wife also running away because she doesn't want to see you?" "That's not it. It would be better if Ruby could just tell him the reason directly." Iskai was actually reflecting on himself. The commander happily teased him. Carefully examining his subordinate, he had a question in mind. "You don't look at your wife with such fierce eyes, do you?" The commander teased while patting his shoulder and passing on experience. "When it comes to treating a wife, you should spoil her unconditionally. Not only accompany her to various social occasions, but also give plenty of gifts and reflect on your own mistakes to the greatest extent." These were the commander's years of accumulated experience, but Iskai couldn't understand any of it. The path to pampering one's wife still needed slow comprehension. And his transaction with the self-defense force along with a few knights aroused the gray-haired man's dissatisfaction. He wanted him to tell the commander about this matter as soon as possible. Once exposed, they would all be in trouble. "You go tell him." Seeing the gray-haired man so agitated, Iskai finally couldn't hold back. "What are you waiting for? Go report it." His slightly threatening aura thoroughly angered the gray-haired man, but he only dared to speak without taking any actual action. Yes, such a coward would naturally be afraid. AI Iban also looked down on the gray-haired man. The gray-haired man was furious upon hearing this, but was ignored by AI Iban, who blocked him behind. Wouldn't all the trouble be gone if we just killed this guy? But to Iskai it wasn't that simple. Too many things had happened to Ruby lately, like being targeted and attacked by monsters. It was very likely a plot from Romana. His father-in-law was powerful, and if he used his daughter to deal with the North, he certainly wouldn't stop at this. But all of this seemed too rushed. Ruby obviously knew nothing. So what to do next? Faced with questions from colleagues and friends, he didn't know what to do and didn't dare to answer. Although children are often like their parents, he didn't want to be as emotionally fragile as his mother, breaking at the slightest touch. His mother had always seemed so happy. But in the end, she still hanged herself from the willow tree in the courtyard. He was afraid, he was terrified. He was afraid of becoming someone like his father. He was afraid Ruby would meet the same fate as his mother. Initially, when Ruby said she liked him, he just thought it was a provocation from her for a divorce. But even though he knew nothing about love, he understood that when someone says they're willing to be beaten out of fear, it's definitely not because of love. What was she afraid of and what was she hoping for? None of this could be known. The dignified daughter of the Pope had so many scars on her body. Even he, an outsider, was shocked to see them. As the cardinal's brother, how could he sit by and watch his sister being tortured? He really didn't understand. He had wanted to ask for clarity, but feared hurting his wife's heart. After all, burying the truth might lessen the pain. When his wife was bullied by servants before, he had turned a blind eye and not corrected it in time. Although he said he would kill everyone, he was more angry at himself. Looking at his wife lying in bed, all he felt was heartache upon heartache. Just as Iskai was about to realize, and the two were about to see better days. Her older brother on the other side couldn't sit still. He had never agreed to this marriage in the first place. It was their father who married Ruby off despite everyone's opposition. That Northern Holy Knight was quite peculiar, actually marrying Ruby to protect his sister. Who gave him such courage? But hearing he was an ascetic, he felt somewhat relieved. What surprised him was that Ruby had caused such a commotion this time. His subordinates brought news that they had searched for 4 days and nights. Such a docile lady could cause so much trouble. Even his subordinates couldn't help but joke. The master had said before that his brother-in-law was a fool, but now it clearly wasn't so. Just mentioning the words brother-in-law made the older brother uncomfortable. To him, brother-in-law Iskai was like a piece of paper to be used and thrown away, nothing more. But thinking about the sight of them holding hands, he felt very unhappy, wanting to fly over immediately and chop off that man's hand. But currently he was too busy. His subordinate paused upon hearing this, his face full of a devious smile. It had been a long time since he had laid hands on the young lady. Fortunately, the older brother was also a pervert. How could such a good thing be left to others? Just need to keep close watch. While Ruby had been sick for half a month, the little princess and AI Iban's sister kept her company, helping her temporarily forget past troubles. Iskai suddenly appeared. She felt somewhat at a loss. Having not acted for so long, she could barely open her mouth. She accidentally twisted her ankle, falling forward, right into Iskai's embrace. Making a fool of herself right after meeting, her face was full of embarrassment. Fortunately, the two siblings were making noise beside them. This finally brought a smile to her face. But she hadn't noticed that Iskai's gaze on her was clearly different from his previous coldness. He suddenly bent down close to her ear. "Ruby, I've kept it safe." The day they left the cave, the dragon had given Ruby a ruby. Hearing Iskai's words by her ear, she shyly said thank you. That ruby is also entrusted to you, although the ruby and her name sounded the same. But Iskai instantly understood her meaning, although he only responded with a hum. But this represented the beginning of their happiness. Looking at the dessert her husband handed over, she still habitually wanted to refuse. But she tasted the long-lost taste. A group of people sat under the tree discussing how to deal with the frost dragon. Originally, the temple wanted to make it an event for the sword fighting competition, but it was still just a cub and an extremely rare species. Most people suggested releasing it. The little princess played with her toys. Poor dragon. Ruby felt sad in her heart too. The frost dragon had been awakened by her. Iskai saw all her sadness. He now always wanted to be with Ruby. The two walking one after another, that scene was extremely beautiful. At times like this, he should reach out then take her hand. "Thankfully you're all right." After holding it in for so many days, Iskai finally spoke what was in his heart. But to Ruby, such beauty was fleeting. She reminded herself not to have illusions. One small mistake and she would fall into an abyss. She was lost in thought. Suddenly, one of Iskai's questions made her very flustered. He wanted to know how she met Bubble. The first time she saw Bubble was at the equestrian meeting. Ruby told him the whole process. He listened silently without a word, and she didn't know what he was thinking. Ruby observed his expression while carefully asking about Bubble and Eagle's situation. She only breathed a sigh of relief when she heard they had returned home. Thinking it was over. Unexpectedly, her husband asked about what happened at the temple, like if she had met anyone. She was stunned. She couldn't say she met those two people. She shook her head vigorously. Iskai sighed. He of course knew Ruby had lied. But none of that mattered. He took his wife's hand again, pulling her into his embrace. His wife was being bullied but wouldn't say. It's all right. He went directly to his childhood friend's brother. What exactly did you do? He demanded an explanation. Seeing the other stammer. Fine, then don't say it. He grabbed his face and gave him a good beating. Listen well. If you dare appear in front of my wife again, don't blame me if I kill you. Iskai finally got it, hearing his wife talk about the southern gardens, where flowers were more numerous than trees, with bird cages and fountains as decorations. Although he said it just sounded like an amusement park. Just because his wife said it was worth seeing. The next day, work began in the garden. Ruby was confused. Her father-in-law was also bewildered. Why was his son acting so strangely? And no matter how beautiful they made it, it would only be temporary. If you're not satisfied, you can have them stop. The old father wanted to have them stop, but he didn't dare. A few days ago, his son had grabbed his collar with bloodshot eyes and told him to stay away from his daughter-in-law. If he made the craftsman stop, his son might eat him alive. If you can't accept it, then don't rush us about our first night. Ruby helplessly complained from the side. Her father-in-law was again urging her to resolve the first night issue. This time she surprisingly didn't feel repulsed but rather expectant, because her heart was slowly changing. Another side, the sister-in-law also hired a cute little girl for her. Named Rona, though young, was capable and clever. Specially assigned as her personal maid. Thinking about how she wouldn't need to bribe maids to do things for her anymore. She was really happy. But the next moment she was confused again. With the sword fighting competition approaching, everyone decided to hold a banquet beforehand. And it was specifically for Ruby. Her brother would handle any problems, she just needed to look beautiful, no need to worry about anything else. Although she said okay on the surface, she was very anxious inside. Since the Freya poisoning incident, her already poor reputation had become even worse. Iskai actually wanted to hold a banquet for her at such a time. It was hard not to suspect there were ulterior motives. But surprisingly, the next day she was invited to the temple by the Archbishop. Not only did he care about her health, but also formally apologized for her being implicated in his niece's poisoning. He even wanted to keep her for lunch. But I already have plans with my husband. Hearing she was going with her husband, the Archbishop seemed to hesitate for a moment. Although just for an instant. Ruby sensed something unusual but couldn't say what it was. My lady. It was Andy. She had come to take the lady to lunch. The Archbishop expressed his envy. It seems Iskai cherishes you very much. Hee, how could that be? But honestly speaking, she really couldn't understand her husband's recent series of actions. Even Andy had been assigned as her personal guard. Looking at the feast comparable to a royal banquet, Ruby was deeply shocked. Do you always eat like this outdoors? Her husband said going home was troublesome, she said. Isn't this more troublesome? Seeing her not eating properly again. Iskai glanced at her. No appetite? Or did the Archbishop give you something good to eat? Not only was he jealous, but personally served ham to his wife. Ruby was stunned for a moment. What's wrong? I've fallen for your gentle offensive again. The knights on the side were dying of embarrassment. But speaking of which, what's the theme of the banquet being held for me? She had originally wanted to get some information from her husband to prepare for winning him over. But he wouldn't reveal anything at all. She didn't plan to ask further anyway. One day she would wear seductive clothes and lure her husband to her room. But would that be too much? Her thoughts were flying everywhere. Suddenly someone mentioned the sword fighting competition. And even brought up her brother. The air instantly fell into silence. Although she wore a smile on her face, she was very averse inside. After all, Iskai certainly must know about the scandal between her and her brother. Even if she could do nothing, she at least hoped her brother wouldn't be mentioned in front of her husband. She ate ham in big bites to hide her embarrassment. Her husband thought she really liked eating it. Do you need anything else? The sudden question put huge pressure on her. She reflexively batted her eyelashes. I need you. Others quickly excused themselves, saying they had matters to attend to. Ruby was mortified on the spot, wishing she could immediately move to another planet to live. Seeing only the two of them left, her husband showed no concern about the previous topic. Can we progress our opening directly about the night? But before she could finish speaking, the man immediately refused. Wait until your body is better, don't push yourself. Hearing these words, Ruby stared with unwillingness. She slapped both hands on the table, wanting to prove she was fine. Unexpectedly, the table was so unstable, almost tipping over all the wild game. Hot water spilled on the man's arm. She trembled in fright. I'm sorry, are you hurt anywhere? She was flustered, but suddenly noticed her husband's handkerchief. This handkerchief was the one she had personally embroidered and given as a gift. She thought it would have been thrown away as trash in some corner, but surprisingly he had kept it. Her anxious heart couldn't help but flutter. Soon it was the day of the banquet. Under the maid's preparations, she was as beautiful as an elf. Even Aaron was stunned. Our Ruby is truly adorable. Since her heart-to-heart talk with Aaron, their relationship had grown increasingly close. Although she didn't know how long this peaceful life would last, she was already very content now. Attending a banquet held specifically for her for the first time, she was extremely nervous. What if no one paid attention to her? What if her husband refused to dance with her? Just as she was thinking this, she ran into her husband. 8-pack abs clearly displayed before her eyes. Ruby instantly covered her face, red to her ears. What kind of clothes were these? They were a bit eye-catching. Her husband said he had just finished a mission and hadn't had time to change. So it was battle armor. She couldn't help but wonder who had designed such perverted clothes. While lost in thought, Iskai reached out his hand. The previous 2 banquets he had let his wife go alone. From now on he could never do that again. Ruby finally understood. Her husband was worried about her being alone. That's why he hadn't had time to change out of his battle armor. Staring at the stretched abs. Not everyone could look good in such clothes. Sure enough, as soon as they appeared, the noble ladies started squealing. Their husbands had worn it too, but why was the effect so different? Even the men were envious. Freya appeared for the first time since being poisoned. Although recovered, she still looked haggard. Unexpectedly, Freya's mother had come too. Although she said she just came to say hello, she cast a sidelong glance at Ruby. Seeing the little fairy so pretty and so good with words, it seems Southerners are all quite uninhibited, harboring who knows what ill intentions. Enough, Iskai directly ordered them to leave. The old woman was so angry that she took it out on her daughter, criticizing her for having disheveled hair. Ruby touched her own bun hairstyle, feeling an indescribable discomfort. You look very good like this. Her husband's compliment instantly improved her mood. Would you like to dance? Aaron and Aiban couldn't help but complain, afraid she would make a spectacle. Unexpectedly, Iskai agreed immediately. The two stood in the center of the dance floor. Ruby felt like she was dreaming. In the original story, Iskai had never danced with any girl. But now he made an exception for her. Holding hands, with music playing. Looking at the tightly pressed abs, she felt a bit dazed. Originally she wanted to seduce him. But now it seemed. How had she ended up being the one seduced? It was their first time dancing together. Not only did they amaze everyone, but also made Freya's eyes red with anger. Watching the girl's light dance steps, her uninhibited smile, so she could shine brightly too. Iskai couldn't help but stare in a daze. He cooperated by reaching out his hand, pulling the girl's hand for a dip. They ended their dance together amid enthusiastic applause. Seeing how they looked at each other, Freya on the side was extremely jealous. Thinking of a few nights ago, she had accidentally discovered her brother crying. She wanted to find out why, but saw her brother had been beaten and was swollen. Tell me, which bastard did this? She looked ready to eat someone while holding back her anger. But she never expected the bastard she spoke of would turn out to be Iskai. And it was for that witch who had been married 5 times. She couldn't believe it at the time. Today, seeing Iskai's abs outfit, seeing the sweet scene before her, it would be a lie to say she wasn't resentful. But she still pretended nothing was wrong despite her swollen red eyes. After Iskai was called away by the Duke, she spoke in a tone showing familiarity with the Duke and son's relationship, showing off in front of Ruby. Then took Ruby's hand, saying she wanted to take her to play together. Looking at how harmonious they seemed, one would think their relationship was very good. But at least Ruby was happy. She had just danced like an elf, drawing noble ladies to come ask for instruction. She went into teaching mode on the spot, the ladies squealing with delight. Some even started gossiping, envying Ruby for having such a wild husband, asking if her heart had raced. The harmonious atmosphere let her tense nerves relax quite a bit. Seeing everyone in good spirits, she spoke in a sweet voice with an embarrassed face. Of course my heart raced. My goodness, this is too sweet. But some people always like to spoil the mood, the blonde lady snorted. She brought up Ruby's recent running away from home. Was it because the relationship was too good, so you couldn't help but create some excitement? Ruby said she was still young and ignorant. She actually elevated it to a matter of national customs. She just hadn't expected Ruby to play dumb very effectively. Although she answered all questions, they weren't really answers to the questions. Since nations were mentioned, she brought up her beloved brother. A few words made the other shut up. In any case, it's good that you've returned safely. Faced with everyone's concern, she smiled in thanks. Her adorable appearance happened to catch her sister-in-law's eye, who couldn't help but reach out to touch her. Ruby turned her head in confusion. Sorry. Seeing her sister-in-law's embarrassment, she still hadn't figured out what happened. At this time, someone else brought up Freya being poisoned. If only they could catch the culprit soon. Freya graciously said not to mention it, but glanced to the side with grievance. Ruby was speechless and awkward, as if she were the culprit. But before knowing the truth, she couldn't blame someone who had been hurt. Her thoughts couldn't help but wander. That day when Freya fled on horseback, was it fear or something else? She didn't want to guess at others' ill intentions, but also dared not trust anyone. This was currently the best choice she could make to survive. She got up and went to the washroom, wanting to use cold water to clear her head. Recent events had made her increasingly anxious. Although still unclear whether Iskai's feelings for her were a passing fancy, pity, or some other emotion. But at least when she ran away from home, he had seriously looked for her and hadn't hurt her monster friends. So she decided to give it a try. Tonight she must win Iskai's heart. Let the rice be cooked. But before she could leave the bathroom, mockery came from several women outside. Just moments ago they were smiling and asking to learn dancing from her. But in the blink of an eye, she's now gossiping behind her back about how experienced she is at finding men, mocking that she hasn't been loved by her husband in half a year of marriage. Looking at those bitter, sour faces, it really is quite irritating. The best way to deal with these wagging tongues is to simply pull back the curtain, making them feel embarrassed and afraid. While everyone was still racking their brains trying to defend themselves, she burst into tears first, sobbing, "I never thought you'd think of me this way. I really should have died at the hands of those monsters." The group, not knowing what to do, hurriedly apologized. But it wasn't over yet. Ruby walked out tearfully, saying she would go find her husband to get a divorce. Perhaps then they wouldn't hate her anymore. When the women heard this, their hearts stopped in their throats. Seeing that consoling wasn't working, one by one they started crying too, repeatedly apologizing and begging for forgiveness. See? Teaching someone a lesson doesn't always require a slap. Sometimes these subtle methods can be more deadly. Once she felt the timing was right, Ruby wiped her nose and eyes, smiling as she promised not to mention divorce to her husband. And they were even grateful to her for it. After she finished her performance and walked out, the banquet hall's balcony passage was already packed with people, looking at the dazzling fireworks. But she wasn't in the mood to appreciate them. Her mind was entirely focused on how to spend the night with her husband. Unexpectedly, while moving through the crowd, someone called her name from behind. Then came a sudden thud. Her painful scream was perfectly covered by the sound of fireworks. By the time Andy found her, she was in too much pain to stand. All she wanted was to seek comfort from her husband. But when she finally made it to her husband's side, she accidentally stepped on the hem of her dress. Her body tilted forward, and she fell right onto her husband's long legs. In front of so many people, she felt utterly embarrassed. She buried her face in her husband's embrace, refusing to get up, wishing she could find a hole to crawl into. It was just a fall. But it was so embarrassing. "It's all right, be good, lift your head." With her husband's encouragement, she finally slowly raised her head. Her husband saw tears at the corners of her eyes. "Why are you crying? You haven't gotten into trouble again, have you?" Though her husband's words left her speechless, she said, "I hurt, so I missed you." When asked where it hurt, she couldn't say, worried tonight's first night would be ruined. But now she couldn't suppress her desire for affection anymore. Like a child with teary eyes, she said, "My foot hurts." Only when she took off her shoes did she discover her toes were badly swollen and even bleeding. Seeing her husband's murderous expression, she shuddered in fear, though not understanding why he was so angry. But right now she needed to calm him down. She slowly reached out her hand, crying out, "Husband," then threw herself into his arms. She explained that she hadn't been threatened or schemed against, she just missed him too much. The entire banquet hall suddenly fell silent. Everyone held their breath, not daring to move. Iskai, who they thought would be even angrier, suddenly let out a sigh of relief. After handing over the investigation of the foot incident to Andy, he cancelled the banquet. While Ruby was getting her wound treated, she was filled with regret. Would tonight's plans be ruined? As the maid bandaged her wounds, she was too scared to lift her head, thinking she would surely be scolded by Iskai. Or perhaps like before, he might want to send her back to her family. When she tried to sneak a peek at the situation, she caught sight of a turtle ornament nearby. Fear instantly permeated every nerve. Painful memories suddenly flooded her mind. It was 3 years ago when her father wanted to marry her off to a certain duke. Her brother was sent to persuade her, but she firmly refused. Later she felt guilty and wanted to apologize to her brother. But when she opened the door and peeked out, she was terrified by what she saw. Her brother, covered in blood, was smiling. In his hand was a small bird that had been tortured to death. That was the first gift she had received from family since coming to this world. She desperately ran forward screaming, but was held back tightly by the maids. And so, she watched helplessly as the small bird was thrown into a glass tank, then devoured piece by the turtle. This is what happens when you defy me. Since then, she developed a psychological trauma, and without mental preparation, she would break down emotionally like she was now. She didn't dare tell anyone. But she didn't know. Her unusual behavior was quickly noticed by her husband. When the maid finished treating the wound and was about to leave, "Wait, take that turtle ornament away too." Before she could react, her husband sat down beside her, thoughtfully helping her wipe away cold sweat. This made her grow bolder. As long as she could win over her husband tonight, she didn't care about losing face. I want to be with you forever. So tonight I especially want to be alone with you." Seeing her husband not responding, she hurriedly waved her hands, "Never mind if you're busy." But unexpectedly, her husband became shy, his ears turning red. "Let's take a walk first then." So she was carried by her husband to the courtyard. At first, this place was just a bunch of bare tree branches. Now it was filled with flowers of various colors, beautiful like a garden in the sky from a novel. The couple sat on a long bench. Ruby couldn't hide her happiness. Before she could say thank you, her husband suddenly took her hand. Oh my, so sudden? But the expected kiss didn't come. Instead, a bracelet was placed on her wrist. It was said to promote health and had healing properties. As soon as he finished speaking, he gave her a golden key, learning that this key could open the treasury and she could freely choose treasures. She trembled in fear. How could I dare? That was the place storing the family's precious inheritances through generations. But her husband proudly said, "Because it's you," I agreed. Ruby clearly understood the weight of this key, feeling indescribably touched. Why was her husband so good to her? "Thank you so much, I really like it." She couldn't help but kiss him. But now her husband was telling her to rest early. Hearing this, it seemed he was going to run away. "No, I don't want to." She tightly wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. "But I'm scared." Hearing the words "I'm scared," Iskai agreed to stay. Originally, she wanted to seduce her husband by keeping her big eyes wide open, then acting spoiled and insisting on staying alone together. But she was suddenly picked up. She could clearly feel her husband's displeasure. Thinking she had failed, unexpectedly, she was carried to her husband's bathroom. Her husband told her to sit quietly and wait. What was he planning? Her confused face became even more confused. The maid helped her change into a bathrobe, and said the young master would personally help her bathe. She was quite shocked. Could it be that he had interpreted her request for companionship as helping her bathe? She really couldn't imagine what that scene would be like. Well, she might as well wash up and go to sleep by herself. Unexpectedly, after humming a few bars of song, her husband suddenly appeared beside her, and dressed so provocatively. While she was still startled, he had already begun the bathing process. Watching her husband seriously selecting shampoo, she finally confirmed that he really was going to help her bathe. This was a good opportunity to improve their relationship. She racked her brains. Maybe she should just pounce on him from behind? But when he turned around, she lost her nerve. Doing that would probably result in her hair being pulled out. So she sat obediently and let him attend to her, although her hair was always pulled and made her scream. Somehow, every time the soap bubbles touched her skin, she felt an indescribable feeling. It was a strange and itchy feeling. Though the man's bathing technique was clearly terrible, she found it incredibly comfortable and warm, feeling the gentleness transmitted through his rough hands. Her heart raced and she couldn't help blushing. But he maintained a calm and serious expression, completely not treating her as a woman. Ruby suddenly felt competitive. She wanted to help wash her husband too. Unexpectedly, her husband's face suddenly darkened. "Are you really treating me like a stone?" Not listening to her excuses, he abruptly put down her soap-covered leg, saying, "Handle it yourself," then turned as if to leave. No, absolutely not. She shamelessly clung to her husband's arm. No matter what her husband said, "I won't let you leave." Her husband said he wouldn't leave, but she wouldn't believe it, so they remained in a standoff by the pool. Unexpectedly, her knee slipped. She lost balance and fell backward, with a splash. The expected pain didn't come when she opened her eyes. She met her husband's impatient gaze. Sensing trouble, she quickly asked about her husband's condition, completely unaware of how alluring she looked at that moment, even though Iskai was the abstinent type. At this moment, he couldn't suppress the restlessness in his heart. He picked up his wife and headed upstairs. Ruby was terrified, being suddenly carried away like this. Based on past experience, it was the prelude to being beaten. Her husband told her to stand still. She was so scared she didn't dare move, thinking if it hurts, she'll just grit her teeth and bear it. But the expected whip didn't come. What fell was her husband's gentleness as he wiped away her water droplets. She didn't understand. Aren't you angry? What do I have to be angry about? Her husband's gentleness touched her scarred heart. But the indelible scars on her body represented her poor and miserable past, and were secrets she didn't want her husband to discover. Sorry, I'm a bit shy. She knew very well that pity and sense of responsibility were only temporary, and her relationship with her husband was like a small boat in stormy seas. When the waves hit, it could easily capsize. She once thought she could change the plot, and even tried to prevent Freya from being poisoned. But the results proved she was overconfident. Perhaps she was too lost in thought that when her husband mentioned her so-called family, she couldn't control her tears. No matter how much she wiped them, they wouldn't stop. Unexpectedly, her hand was tightly held by her husband. Then he gently pressed her hand against his eyes. Don't cry anymore, please. Seeing tears flowing from his wife's eyes, he was going crazy. What should I do to make you feel secure? Thinking about how he always avoided her under the pretext of being considerate. I'm sorry, I won't do that anymore. But before becoming true husband and wife, Iskai decided to give Ruby the choice. Whether to leave now or stay. Whatever the choice for you, I can do anything. But once she stays, even if Ruby begs to leave, he absolutely won't let go. Looking at the sincerity and loss in his eyes, Ruby was genuinely shocked. In this cursed cage, there was actually someone willing to spend their life with her. Her arms slowly climbed up his long neck. I want to stay here and spend my life with friends and you. The weight of this sentence was enough to dispel the unpleasant past. She stood on tiptoe when she touched the softness of his lips, feeling his passionate response. At this moment, her husband's loving gaze had already explained everything without reserve. Who had fallen into the trap? Who had been ensnared? What exactly made her husband fall into love's swamp? Although she no longer knew. But hearing her husband call her name and say I love you, she could be certain. Me too. Thankfully you're willing. As the solemn bells of the temple rang, everyone witnessed their qualitative leap. Ruby also became increasingly busy. Recently, she received hundreds of invitation letters, from small afternoon teas to various social activities. Her sister-in-law was even preparing to transfer the household management rights. She worried it would cause resentment from others. I'd like to see who dares. Her sister-in-law suddenly darkened her face, firmly supporting her as the family's mistress. Though she was happy, she still knew her place. If she suddenly participated in family affairs, the head maid would surely cause trouble. So she politely declined, using the excuse of not wanting to make trouble. But Erin was determined, planning to teach her bit by bit. Speaking of this, Erin suddenly remembered. Since Mother's death those few years ago, the Duke's mansion had always been managed by the head maid. Whenever Mother was mentioned, she always couldn't help feeling sad. She remembered when Mother was around. Sometimes she was like a luxury-pursuing noblewoman, sometimes like a life-abandoning madwoman. And her parents were always arguing. She didn't know the specific reason. She only knew that Mother's death was the catalyst for her brother and father's deteriorating relationship, and the reason her brother chose to become a holy knight, only hoping to see Mother one more time. She accidentally spoke of her brother's past, but this is her exclusive secret, just between us two. Hearing the word exclusive, Ruby bloomed into a smile. But what surprised her more was that several senior knights actually sought her out privately. Seeing the blonde man's hesitant manner, it seemed he had something important to say, yet couldn't get it out after a long while. This frustrated the gray-haired man beside him. Shouting that it was too slow, having no choice, the gray-haired man had to say it himself. Madam, do you know about frost wolves? Ruby certainly knew. Because unlike other monsters that dissipate after death, they not only leave behind magic crystals but also their corpses. So she had a deep impression. If that's the case, can you communicate with frost wolves? Ruby paused. She remembered her husband telling her to stay away from monsters for now. She originally wanted to refuse. But hearing the blue-haired man's sarcastic tone, saying she wasn't very useful, her anger immediately flared up. Putting her husband's words aside for now, she firmly said, I want to go. After all, these people had also kept her secret. Consider it repaying a debt, more importantly. She wanted to shut up the blue-haired man forever. Moreover, the blonde man gave her a bag of chocolates. She followed them to the destination without another word. Looking at the wolves howling, she was almost scared enough to wet herself. But she still wanted to take a closer look. So she was escorted forward by the group. She finally saw clearly it was the most fierce alpha wolf. She told the others to stay put, then walked forward alone. She took off her heavy hood and squatted down. Hello. She thought she would be attacked. Unexpectedly, the alpha wolf also sat down, seeing that it had lowered its guard. Unexpectedly, half a leg suddenly appeared at her feet. Ruby jumped back in fright. But there were no wolves missing legs in the pack. They were circling around the severed leg. She could clearly feel the alpha wolf's deep emotions. It was sad and angry. She couldn't exactly describe what kind of emotion it was. But the alpha wolf was indeed grieving for not finding the leg's owner. Fortunately, through the wound on the severed leg, the blonde man and others determined it was likely the work of poachers. They prepared to turn nearby villages upside down, leaving only the blue-haired man to protect her. Just as she was worrying about what if the leg's owner was dead, suddenly someone thoughtfully handed her a blanket. And that person turned out to be Andy. She was suddenly dumbfounded. Where Andy appears means Iskai is also here. Just hearing a whap sound, the blue-haired man was sent flying far away. Iskai was furious. His subordinates not only planned all this behind his back but had bought off his simple-minded wife with just a bag of chocolates. And his wife was currently sneaking snacks with Andy. She guiltily put the chocolate back in her pocket. Seeing these people about to argue, "Everyone please calm down." She wanted to help persuade her husband. Unexpectedly, her husband turned his words toward her. Worried she would get hurt. Do these people look capable of fighting wolves? But Ruby felt very guilty. After all, she had always been causing trouble, but before she could get emotional, her husband angrily drew his sword. "Who told you to do this?" "I'm going to kill them." Ruby quickly explained that it was her fault. Everyone had to work hard looking for her. It was also her who awakened the frost wolf, almost causing everyone to lose their lives. Besides being good at comforting small animals, she was completely useless. But she still wanted to help her husband, not wanting to be everyone's burden. These words deeply moved the grown men. Her husband also stroked her head, telling her not to mind. After all, she was never a burden. The most important thing now was to resolve the frost wolf issue. After beating up the poachers, they brought the wolves back to the previous location. They thought this would solve the problem. Unexpectedly, this frost wolf was female, looking at its build and proportions. Iskai then realized this was the alpha wolf's mate. TDS beloved wife being hurt like this by humans. The alpha wolf probably wouldn't let it go easily. He decided to go alone to deliver the wolf's wife. Ruby disagreed. The wolves looked super fierce. She feared something might happen to her husband. The blonde man came over to comfort her, saying, "Iskai can fight a group of ghosts alone, you don't need to worry." But she was still concerned and wanted to go together. However, she was rejected by her husband. At this moment, the female wolf suddenly groaned in pain. She immediately reached out to stroke it. Like comforting a child. There, it's okay, don't be afraid. The female wolf visibly became more docile. She proudly looked at her husband, thinking surely he would take her along now. But still no, seeing that reasoning wouldn't work. She blinked her emotional eyes. "Please? I want to be with you." Her husband indeed had no resistance. Had to let her come along. Fortunately, the alpha wolf didn't go berserk. The alpha wolf lovingly kissed his wife. Look at their intimate behavior. Their relationship was even more enviable than human couples. But what was more surprising was that the blue-haired man, who usually didn't think much of Ruby, actually said words of thanks. This made Ruby very happy, finally feeling like she was a bit useful. Hearing her husband praise her capabilities, she smiled even more brilliantly. Seeing her smile, Iskai was also happy. Having been outside for so long, his wife had gotten all smelly. He pulled her over in one motion. "Little one, don't move, let me wash you." She thought it would be like last time in the bathroom. Unexpectedly, it was a different way. Only after 2 hours did they reluctantly separate. He wanted to go further but was stopped by his wife. Someone was standing not far away and still underage, currently red-faced with embarrassment. He turned and rode away at full speed. The couple silently gazed at each other. The next second, they both burst into smiles. He picked up his wife and put her on horseback. "Let's go, we're going home." The words "going home" were inexplicably warming. "Okay, let's go home." Meanwhile, her brother's subordinates' plan hadn't succeeded. They had intended to hurt Ruby's foot to drive a wedge between the couple. Unexpectedly, not only did they fail, but it made the couple's relationship even better. Should have broken her leg instead. The black-robed man was already furious, and someone in the shadows was still mocking, ridiculing him as matchmaker. "Isn't this our great spy master?" Following his gaze, his so-called spy master turned out to be the Grand Bishop of the temple, Freya's uncle. On the other side, the first ray of morning light shone through the window. She opened her eyes, seeing her husband's handsome face. Hearing him say he had to go to work now, she felt reluctant in her heart. "If only I could go with you." Iskai felt the same way. His gentle kiss fell on his wife's face, repeatedly cautioning her not to leave with her monster friends or be lured away by chocolate again. He was completely worried about his silly wife. After all, they still lacked understanding. So if you want anything, you must tell me. Looking at his wife's slightly reddened smile, he reached out, gently holding her tightly in his arms. You must wait for me obediently at home. Her husband suddenly becoming so gentle, Ruby felt truly content for the first time. Even if it all turned out to be just a dream in the end, she was willing to sink into this happiness. Today she was to host her first tea party. Unexpectedly, while she was getting dressed, her father-in-law came to visit. The first thing he asked about was the treasury key. Could it be he wanted it back? Later she learned that he was actually worried his son was too rigid. So he came specifically to tell her she could take whatever she wanted from the treasury. Only after seeing the bracelet on her wrist did her father-in-law finally feel somewhat relieved. Though this bracelet looked unremarkable, it was actually the family's ancestral heirloom, made from a dragon's heart by their ancestors. Only the lady of the house could possess it. Ruby was shocked. Such a brilliant jewel was actually a dragon's heart. Thinking of her father-in-law's displeased expression at the banquet, could it be he was unhappy seeing her wear this bracelet? So she tactfully tried to return it. Unexpectedly, her father-in-law seemed to read her mind. He explained his anger at the banquet was actually because he saw his son dressed inappropriately, for which he apologized on his son's behalf. Perhaps knowing his son was too awkward with words, he wanted to know Ruby's true feelings, whether she liked this place or liked Iskai as a person. Ruby paused, then immediately went into acting mode. Of course I like your son, I fell deeply in love with him at first sight. Are you sincere? Seeing her father-in-law's expression, he seemed unconvinced. Because Ruby always gave people a cautious feeling, just like his deceased wife. Being so easily struck at her heart's wound, Ruby never expected her father-in-law to be such a sensitive person. So she threw away her false mask and responded sincerely, I am sincere. Looking at her father-in-law's satisfied departing figure, she felt somewhat sympathetic, but being accepted by her husband's family made her more excited. In the afternoon, the tea party was held in the waterside pavilion Iskai had built for her, drawing great envy from the other ladies. This might seem like showing off, but her sister-in-law insisted that with such capabilities, one should be high profile. But someone's presence made her feel completely uncomfortable. Wherever Aaron was, Freya would definitely be there. Originally a very beautiful face, but she just had to open her mouth. When others were marveling at how much Iskai doted on his wife, she said, a person suddenly changing can be fatal. What was originally a harmonious tea party was almost ruined by her sarcastic remarks. Fortunately, the blonde man suddenly arrived, making everyone shift their attention. He said he came to pick up his sister. But Ruby knew very well this was just an excuse to see her sister-in-law. However, she hadn't expected. As soon as the blonde man said he was leaving, the ladies left in droves. Now she finally witnessed the charm of a handsome man. But her mind was on those two little ones who always dropped things when they came to play. She carefully looked around. Sure enough, there was a small hairpin on the ground. Just as she was feeling helpless, Freya suddenly appeared from behind. She only then realized this person hadn't left. Hearing Freya praise the pavilion Iskai designed for her, she outwardly responded perfunctorily while inwardly thinking, just get lost already. Unexpectedly, Freya changed her tone. Are you satisfied? Seeing she didn't quite understand, Freya darkly repeated, are you satisfied now? Or rather, are you happy now? She even mocked Ruby for being too cheap, ready to throw herself at any man who showed her the slightest kindness. If that's the case, wouldn't you be just as happy with a different man and a different marriage? Seeing Ruby not taking the bait, are you really not understanding? Or just pretending not to understand? Iskai is the king's only nephew. With the king having no son, Iskai is the next monarch. The princess from some small place. How dare you say you're worthy of him? She even started preaching, saying things like first love is like intestinal poison. Iskai was just bewitched by Ruby's doll-like beauty. So-called love was as fragile as flower petals that couldn't withstand a single blow. Actually, even without her saying it, Ruby understood that human hearts were most fickle. After all, she experienced it every day. But this wasn't a reason for her to back down. You keep talking about my husband, but I don't recall my husband ever mentioning you. Struck at a sore spot, Freya indeed froze. Her lips twitched slightly. She forced a big laugh. You probably think I'm your love rival. Still thick-skinned enough to say this is a kind of carriage. But she believed that for the glory of the North, Iskai would eventually make the right choice. Heh, that sounds so nice. Putting on a hypocritical pose just to express that she should be Iskai's rightful princess, Ruby finally stopped tolerating. She stepped forward one step at a time. Actually, you're afraid of losing Iskai, aren't you? I never expected the noble Lady Freya would have a habit of eyeing other people's husbands. She thought saying this would make her have some shame and disappear quickly. But she still underestimated the other party's bottom line. Suddenly, Freya splashed a cup of tea on her own face. People who returned saw this and thought Ruby had thrown it. At this point, she became the villain in everyone's eyes who bullied kind people. Her sister-in-law asked her why she would do such a thing. She simply kept quiet. After all, no matter how she explained, no one would believe her. But unexpectedly, the blonde man wasn't misled. Instead, he rationally let her tell the truth. Seeing her lowered head, her sister-in-law also became anxious. Just say something. Freya interjected from the side, let it go. After all, I don't want to make a big deal out of this. It wasn't me. Ruby finally couldn't take it anymore. She held back her grievances. Whether in the past or now, I really haven't done anything. She thought that becoming true husband and wife with her husband would let her have family and kinship. Even when Freya falsely accused her, she still tried to explain. But as long as Freya said a few pitiful words, no matter what she said, nobody believed her, the outsider. Even her sister-in-law's final look seemed to say, I'm so disappointed in you. Everything she tried to cling to was like the sunset streaming through the window. Though it didn't belong to her, for a moment it did fall upon her. Although she tried to convince herself to adapt, her heart still couldn't stop feeling scared and sad. Afraid of being driven away by her husband again. After trying so hard, she still wasn't trusted. The tears she had held back for so long. Finally, she fell in streams when she heard her personal maid's concern. She suddenly buried her head in the maid's embrace, quietly venting the grievances in her heart. Perhaps because she was already disheartened, she couldn't even muster any hatred for Freya. After all, she was the novel's female protagonist. The male and female leads were meant to be together. She went to the greenhouse garden to clear her mind, thinking of all the warm moments with her husband. She still couldn't bear to give up like this. She thought if she sincerely reflected and begged, perhaps her husband would show mercy. Unexpectedly, the head maid's sudden appearance made even her last hope of begging disappear. It turned out that to change the head maid's view, Erin had told her about Ruby's eating disorder secret. Ruby could actually understand. After all, to Erin, the head maid was someone she relied on more than her birth mother. But the head maid betrayed Erin's original intention. Under the banner of doing what's best for her master, she said Ruby was just like the Duchess, nothing but trouble. She even said if the position of lady of the house was cursed. So she hoped the madame would leave. This surprised Ruby immensely. The head maid who had always served the Duchess actually felt relieved about the Duchess's death. But why did she want her to leave? I would rather die than leave this place. All that nonsense about first love being like poison. Dreams making people lose sight of themselves. Casually interpreting others' feelings and trying to use these thoughts to drive her away. On what grounds? She was the rightful mistress. Yet being threatened by a servant to get lost. She directly slapped the other party to teach them a lesson. The old maid's face fell along with her glasses being knocked to the ground. The assertive Ruby made the old woman suddenly dumbfounded. So you were pretending all along. What's wrong? Isn't this what you hoped for? The old woman shouted that she would report to the young miss. Then go ahead. She stepped closer one step at a time. She really wanted to see. How could a mere head maid contend with a princess of a nation? If it weren't for Erin's sake, I would have ripped out your tongue long ago. Watching the old woman leave, gnashing her teeth. She knew this brief happiness was about to end. After her husband returned, she cried and said she was wrong. She told him to go find someone he truly cared about. But she didn't know that the person he truly cared about had always been her. Whether it was the first time he asked her to return to her family, or that instinctive gesture of pushing her away after Freya was poisoned. It was all because he feared she would be in danger again. Feared she would be contaminated by the poisoned blood. As she listened to her husband apologizing and clearing up all misunderstandings, Ruby was completely shocked. Feeling his sincere heart, tears of grievance rolled down her cheeks. She punched his chest again and again, repeatedly saying it wasn't her doing. Why do people always target me? She howled loudly. This broke Isuke's heart completely. Yet he could do nothing. He had merely gone out to work. When he returned and heard from his sister about the tea party, he frantically ran back to their room. But his wife wasn't there. The maid said she went to the greenhouse. He ran there like lightning. But it was pitch dark all around with no sign of Ruby. He was terrified at that moment, thinking his wife had run away again like before. Suddenly there was a splash of water. He saw the person he held dear in his heart. And finally his worried heart could rest. He quietly approached Ruby from behind. What are you doing here? This time he spoke without any blame. Instead, he teased if she was playing hide and seek with him. So what about the reward? Ruby was stunned. How about I give you a kiss? He chuckled gently. leaning down and bringing his face closer, saying, "Come on then." He was like a light, dispelling the fog in Ruby's heart. She stood on tiptoes and kissed her husband's lips, thinking he knew nothing. Or perhaps he was testing her. But either way, this kiss might be their last sweet moment. Thinking of this, she began to cry sadly. Whether her husband believed her or not, she wanted to say she had done nothing wrong. Neither in the past nor now. I really haven't done anything. Isuke seemed to see Ruby back in that cave again. Fortunately this time, his usually harsh mouth finally learned to speak properly. Not only did he choose to believe without reason, but he also explained all the misunderstandings accumulated for so long. Looking at his wife's hands that had just punched him, he worriedly caressed them, wondering if they were hurting. Another kiss fell as he spoke. He felt remorseful. Ruby also felt heartache. She stared at the wine in her husband's hand. She grabbed it and took several big gulps. The strange, unfamiliar taste shot straight to her head, making her feel awful. Isuke chuckled mischievously. He poured a little more wine into the coffee. Indeed, this taste was much better. Her husband's gentleness made her begin to hesitate. The things Freya said earlier in the day, and their argument. Should she tell Isuke about it? But she was afraid of not being trusted, of losing everything in an instant and returning to square one. Faced with her husband's questions, she still lacked the courage to tell the truth. But Isuke was worried about hurting her, because in a few days there would be a grand sword-fighting ceremony. But the scenes of hunting monsters would be cruel. Isuke couldn't prevent Ruby from attending, so the only thing he could do was end the competition quickly, win first place and give her the flower of glory. That way no one would dare look down on or bully her again. Ruby was stunned that her husband would risk his life to participate in the competition, just to prevent her from being bullied. In that moment she finally understood why her husband had always prevented her from encountering monsters, and why he was so angry when she ran away with Bubble and was found. It was all because he feared she would end up hurt and heartbroken. But she still wanted to test and confirm one more thing. She called out to Isuke and told him everything that happened today. Isuke knelt before her, vowing to silence those who bullied her forever. Even if it sparked a family war, it didn't matter, as long as it could make his wife feel a little better. He was willing to give everything. He gently caressed his wife's hand. "So please tell me, what should I do to stop you from hiding away to cry?" His eyes were full of earnest desire. But Ruby felt unworthy. Hot tears fell one by one. Feeling that the happiness her husband gave was too dreamlike, she didn't dare have too many expectations. She had lived 2 lives. But in both lives she was abandoned by her parents, unwelcome wherever she went and never trusted by anyone. So when she spoke the truth about what happened during the day, because she feared becoming bothersome, she instinctively omitted the process, habitually stating only conclusions. If the other person showed even slight displeasure, she would take all the blame upon herself. But her husband held her hand. "Please don't worry about anything except yourself, because you are very important to me. So tell me slowly everything that happened today, everything you heard." But even simply recounting the facts was very difficult for Ruby. After hesitating for a long time, she finally squeezed out one wish. "Please don't grow tired of me." After all, they all said that Isuke's love for her was like an ephemeral bloom, that he would eventually grow tired. She had tried hard not to be affected. But those who said these things were all people very close to Isuke. So regarding Isuke's feelings for her, she became a bit uncertain. This made Isuke feel a moment of pain. When Ruby made that wish, he felt both heartache and complete helplessness. Understanding his wife's insecurity, he could only stand up and kneel on one knee. His warmth healed Ruby's wounded heart. She kept kissing her husband's hand while saying thank you repeatedly. "What a silly girl. What is there to thank for? I will always stand on your side." Hearing her husband's urgent words, seeing those loving eyes, she still couldn't believe it. Did she really deserve to be loved like this? What if one day she did something very bad? Would her husband still stand by her side? Unexpectedly, her husband stood up, lovingly touching her forehead, saying he would not only be her accomplice, but they would be of one heart as husband and wife. She finally showed a hint of a smile. What if she became spoiled? It's okay, you can be even worse. Her husband's doting completely defeated her. A kiss suddenly came forward. She was willing to be blinded by the dream her husband created, and hoped magic would happen to her. Meanwhile, Aaron's mood remained very heavy. Was the truth Freya spoke really how things originally were? As close friends who shared everything, she should have believed without reservation. But she felt something wasn't right. When she first met Ruby, she actually felt more sympathetic pity. Even a tiny bit of relief. After all, if Ruby hadn't married into the family, she would have married there. But thinking of Ruby's timid appearance, what exactly was she afraid of? And why was Freya so eager to defend herself? Before she could think it through, the butler came to report that something had happened in the front hall. She ran over with clicking heels, only to see Iske holding a sword against the head maid's throat. She used her life to shield those under her brother's sword, only begging her brother to spare the wrongdoing servant. After all, to her, that servant was like a mother. But when the lies were exposed, the head maid still refused to repent. She pointed at the gardener who testified, saying that he was the liar. Iske was furious. Such a shameless person had actually stayed in the Duke's house for so long. But Erin felt terribly guilty. If she hadn't revealed Ruby's secret, the head maid wouldn't have said those things. After all, this was her fault. How could she let the head maid take the blame? She turned around, telling everyone to leave, but was harshly stopped by Iske. He wanted everyone to watch with wide eyes what happens to servants who disrespect their mistress. But I have something to tell you. It's about Mother and Ruby. It absolutely cannot be heard by outsiders. As soon as Erin finished speaking, she signaled the butler to take everyone away. Iske didn't understand things that outsiders couldn't know. How did the head maid know so clearly about these things that couldn't be known by others? If that's the case, then there's even more reason to dispose of her. He raised his sword to kill her. Unexpectedly, Erin suddenly stepped forward to block him. Her action startled him completely. Please, brother. Erin promised she would handle this matter. What about Ruby then? Painless punishments will only let the same things happen again and again, don't you understand? Erin of course understood everything, seeing her brother's displeased expression. What about you? Why does she protect the head maid so much before Mother's death? What kind of life was she living? As her brother, how much do you know? Her beloved mother. Grabbing her throat. It's all because of you that the Duke won't come see me. Mother truly had murderous intent towards her. When her life hung by a thread, the one who came to save her wasn't her brother or father, but her wet nurse, the head maid. A feeling of suffocation surged in Iske's heart. He had always known Mother had a mental illness, but he never knew about what his sister had endured. Why didn't you tell me? At least he could have helped share the burden. Erin held back her grievances, wanting to say. But once spoken, Mother's illness could no longer be hidden. Moreover, brother had to receive air education every day. Too busy to even have a chance to see her. So besides the head maid, who could she rely on then? What could she do? Therefore, she absolutely could not allow her brother to kill the only person who had protected her. Iske could only let them leave. He was now full of guilt. He remembered the wounds on his sister's face back then. He thought she had been bullied by others, but his sister said she was accidentally scratched while playing with Mother. Still comforting him not to worry, the sword in his hand gripped tighter and tighter. Yet he no longer had the courage to act. If only when his sister held him back, he had properly cared about her concerns, would the outcome have been different? On the other side, Erin couldn't believe. The wet nurse who had cared for her like a mother since childhood was actually a person full of evil intentions, and even tried to deceive her, in the end saying it was all for her own good. But how could that be considered good? Erin's heart was bleeding. Why did you lie? Why did you smear her deceased mother? Seeing the wet nurse kneeling before her again, constantly apologizing and begging for forgiveness, she was bitterly disappointed, holding back her reluctance. You leave right now. Ignoring the wet nurse's terrified expression, she grabbed the packed suitcase that was already prepared and threw it in front of the head maid. You will never step foot in this place again. The head maid completely panicked, tears mixed with cold sweat, tightly grabbing her young mistress's skirt, trembling and begging for another chance. But no matter how much she pledged her loyalty, Erin didn't want to hear any more, her tear-stained face full of resolve and disappointment. She yanked her hand away from the head maid's grasp and walked out the door. Having to personally drive away someone so close, she felt more heartbroken than anyone. But with her brother's temper, he would surely have killed the wet nurse in front of everyone. Yet that was her closest person. Except for blood ties, no different from a mother. How could she watch her wet nurse die? This outcome was perhaps the best choice for everyone. After secretly seeing off her wet nurse, unexpectedly Iske came to her door, looking at his sister's cold back. His brows were full of heartache. He hadn't noticed any of his sister's childhood experiences. Although he knew it was too late for regret now, he still wanted to understand what exactly Mother had done to his sister. Can you tell me? And the cause of those things was because Mother had developed an illness where she would vomit after eating. Sometimes eating very little or not at all, but sometimes eating as if she hadn't eaten for several lifetimes. Out of concern, Erin went to check on Mother's condition, only to see Mother forcing herself to vomit. She grabbed Erin, threatening her that if she dared tell anyone, she would kill her in front of everyone. But she never blamed Mother. After all, Mother was just ill. Those eyes tortured into emptiness. She still remembers them to this day. Isuke listened with horror, yet felt completely helpless. But besides you, did father know about these things? Who knows? Eren had no hope in father. After all, she had barely seen father a few times back then. Speaking to this point, she suddenly felt some pity for her brother. Perhaps this is just how married couples are. If one party is determined to hide something, the other party won't know at all, just like now. Now? Isuke had a bad premonition. That's right. Ruby's current state is just like mother's back then. Eren told Isuke about Ruby's forced vomiting. Finally knowing the truth, he was completely furious. The shallow bite mark on his wife's hand was actually a sign of forced vomiting, because the symptoms were the same as his deceased mother. When she first saw it, his sister had already guessed roughly, but he had thought his wife just wasn't in the mood to eat properly. No wonder she couldn't put on even a bit of weight. When his sister revealed the truth, Isuke felt his heart being pierced. He couldn't help but start to feel afraid. He remembered father saying then that mother was just feeling a bit unwell. When he became a qualified heir, mother would get better and he would be able to see her. But what he waited for was his mother hanging herself. Seeing father crying while holding mother, he felt no sympathy, instead feeling everything was father's fault. So, to prevent the scene before him from happening again, he had always rejected various women until he got married with Luby to protect his sister. It was just taking one step. But his thoughts began to waver. He was afraid of following in his father's footsteps, yet couldn't help falling in love with this girl, and letting that love take root and sprout in his heart. But his wife always shrinking her shoulders cautiously. Who exactly had hurt such a fragile you? He wanted to ask but didn't dare, afraid the question would hurt her. But seeing the light gradually returning to his wife's eyes, he naively thought she had walked out of the shadows. Thinking of this, even his heart trembled. Although finding the source of the problem was most important now, the influence of those around was more deadly. Because those who had hurt his wife were, without exception, all people very familiar to him. He remembered when Ruby went missing in the forest that time. He actually believed Freya's words, and went to suspect Ruby of lying. The more he recalled the past, the more he could not forgive himself. Eren asked him to keep their conversation secret from Ruby. But as long as you keep quiet, nothing will happen. Perhaps knowing she was in the wrong, Eren didn't argue. But Isuke was curious about the tea party incident. Yet she impatiently told her brother himself to ask Freya, "Isn't Freya your friend too?" "My friend?" Unexpectedly, Isuke not only denied it, but said it was only for her sake. That he treated Freya as a person, never expecting she would be less than human. Eren couldn't believe that her best friend was such a person in her brother's eyes. Even more unbelievable was that Freya had spilled the tea and then framed Ruby. Although she also found her friend suspicious, she still suggested letting the parties involved clarify face to face. Unexpectedly, this completely angered Isuke. His wife had been scared to tears. A face-to-face confrontation was impossible. He just needed Eren to relay his words exactly as spoken. Better keep your head clear. If not for Ruby and Eren's sake, he would have already killed everyone in the Marquis' household. And he really didn't understand. Ruby was both his wife and Eren's family member. Why do you always choose to believe outsiders? He was very angry, yet didn't know who this anger was directed at. Although his mood was terrible, there was something more important. "Eren, I have something to ask of you. After the sword competition begins, please take good care of Ruby." In the morning, receiving a room full of clothes and jewelry from her husband, Ruby spent all morning carefully dressing up. Her golden hair adorned with a crown of golden leaves and pearls, looking beautiful like an elf fallen from heaven. The maids were all extremely envious. "It seems the young master really loves you." Yes, she felt it too. Since she received gifts, she should thank him immediately. She opened the door, unable to wait. Unexpectedly, her husband's office seemed very lively. She peeked half her little head through the door crack. It turned out to be Iban and others. "Never mind, I'll come back later." But sharp-eyed Isuke had already spotted her. Suddenly hearing her name called, she was startled. She frantically explained a bunch. "But it's okay." Isuke had already walked to her front and asked her to come in. Even Iban, who witnessed the tea party incident, specially prepared a place for her. Gray-haired man's venomous comments on Isuke caused the farce. Everything here made Ruby feel the atmosphere was very nice. She thought everyone would feel awkward when meeting, but surprisingly nothing was different from before. However, looking at the two being forcibly dragged away, she felt a bit apologetic. Yet couldn't help feeling happy from the bottom of her heart. Her husband was curious about why she was happy. Without thinking, she said, "It's because of you, but more accurately because of your gifts. I really like them." Her husband was also happy. Being patted on the head by her husband, she smiled obediently. "Does this suit me?" She touched the golden leaf crown on her head, cheeks slightly red. Isuke couldn't see the accessories anymore. He immediately became dazed, leaning down to hug his wife and giving her a kiss. He finally understood why the fat lizard took his wife, so it was because you're beautiful. Actually calling the cute dragon a fat lizard. Ruby immediately panicked, seeing the familiar national flag in the distance. She just remembered her disgusting brother would arrive tomorrow. Her husband thought she wanted to go welcome him together, but she quickly refused. In others' eyes, she and her brother were deeply affectionate siblings. But only she knew. That brother of hers was actually a pervert. So she had been worried about having to personally welcome him. Unexpectedly, her husband took on this responsibility himself, telling her not to worry, just wait obediently in the banquet hall. Her husband's words were like a warm sunbeam gently piercing through her heart, warming her pain. When she snuggled into her husband's embrace, she wanted so much to tell the truth about being abused by her family. The so-called happiness was just pretense. If she did tell, what kind of expression would her husband show? Would he still stand by her side? But she didn't know. Isuke had actually discovered the abnormality long ago. That day after learning his wife was sick, he confirmed what he had suspected. So, he asked Eren to keep watching Ruby for him after the sword competition began. Of course, mainly to prevent her family members from approaching Ruby, especially that good brother. As for the reason, he didn't want to say right now. Amidst the bustling crowd of commoners, the cardinal brother arrived forcefully. This real battle was only just beginning. This was a grand meeting gathering bigwigs from various countries. Ruby was especially radiant today. Before her husband brought back her brother, little assistant Andy was her bodyguard. Because of the footstepping incident at the previous banquet, Andy had been training desperately lately, though he had indeed grown taller and stronger. But still had a baby face. Ruby couldn't help but secretly laugh. Suddenly, a Miss Rutabaga made her face gradually freeze. It was Duke Alfonso. He was the third person whose engagement Ruby had broken off. She had once mocked that his thing was too small. Ruby immediately wanted to find a hole to crawl into. "You've got the wrong person," she abandoned the confused Andy and fled in panic. Not only because she had made him the laughingstock of the whole country, but more because in the later plot of the original story, this man was one of those who caused her family's downfall. Although that rumor came from her perverted brother's hand, it was ultimately because of him. That person must be looking for a chance to take revenge. How could she avoid him at the banquet? She was going crazy with anxiety. Faced with the enthusiastic greeting of the cute little sister, she had no attention to spare. She looked around while perfunctorily responding. The little sister immediately became pitiful. "Is it because you hate my stupid brother that you won't look at me or like me?" It seemed the little sister thought the tea party incident had caused a rift between her and her brother. She cried more and more sadly. Ruby was completely panicked, but she really didn't dislike Iban. As she was thinking how to explain, she was moved by the little sister's words. Could it be that the Marquis's daughter bullied you again? Her determined little eyes though filled with tears. She never expected this little girl would trust her so much. But right at this moment she was caught up by someone she didn't want to see. There was also someone eavesdropping in the corner. Ruby wished she could find a hole to crawl into, yet had to force herself to say hello and pretend to be happy about the chance meeting. The awkwardness was palpable even through the screen. But unexpectedly, her ex-husband instead showed a gentle face, even seeming somewhat relieved. After all, Ruby had always avoided him before. Even when she finally left, she didn't give him a chance to say goodbye. Seeing Ruby's apologetic and sincere apology, he hurriedly comforted her in panic. He also mentioned that he had found a marriage partner recently, and was truly happy that Ruby had found a good person. Thinking of those past fantasies, if he had been a bit braver then, what would they be like now? It was just that everyone was too young then. He hoped Ruby wouldn't blame herself anymore. Even though he knew he no longer had the right to interfere, he still wanted to confirm if Ruby was doing well. He was still as gentle as before. Ruby couldn't help but feel touched. "I'm doing very well, thank you for your concern." This time her smile was genuine. Suddenly there was a commotion at the entrance. As her brother entered, her heart couldn't help but clench, because it was time to act again. At this nationally watched sword fighting ceremony, originally Isuke and her brother-in-law should have been the focus. As the cardinal of the Romana kingdom, her brother received a grand reception from the emperor. Even the duke wore a smiling face. The diplomatic groups appeared harmonious. Yet it was all fake and perfunctory. Especially her brother's humble appearance made Ruby's heart shudder even more. As the emperor's speech ended, this banquet finally began amidst the noise. Just after saying goodbye to her ex-husband, her brother and Isuke appeared before her. She forcefully suppressed her inner fear. "I've been waiting for you, brother." Seeing her lark-like etiquette, Isuke's heart stirred, completely unaware that Ruby had returned to hell. Her brother's face was beaming. He teased that his sister's greeting lacked emotion. After speaking, he even opened his arms, eager for others to know his filthy thoughts. "Come on, quick," his smiling face gradually losing patience. After successfully holding his good sister tightly in his arms, that black hand finally couldn't resist forcefully warning. "It seems newlywed life is indeed wonderful." When letting go, he returned to fake concern. Ruby had to endure the disgust. She praised her brother's increasingly handsome face. The scene of loving siblings, how could others not envy? Familiar scenes, familiar reactions, everything was no different from before. After the siblings finished talking, Isuke walked to his wife's front. "You look beautiful today." The praise he had held back for so long finally came out. Ruby was truly happy at this moment. "Perhaps it's because I'm wearing the clothes you gave me. And you look very handsome today too." Isuke blinked his eyes in disbelief, confirming his wife was really complimenting him. His eyes couldn't help but reveal a tender look. Gently taking his wife's hand, he kissed the back of her delicate hand. Time seemed to freeze at that moment. But what moved Ruby's heart even more was her husband's gentle "Princess, this is my honor. Looks like I'll have to compliment you more often." The sweet young couple holding hands. How could her brother not come to interfere? He kept calling brother-in-law, pretending to be very happy and polite. People would think Ruby was a very happy woman. But only she knew this was all just an act. So for this farce to continue, she must cheerfully accept the role of good sister assigned to her. Oscar-worthy acting not only fooled her husband's eyes, but also drew Freya's jealousy. Relying on being the high priest's niece, she eagerly came to greet the brother, saying she had long admired him. But after just a few sentences she brought up Ruby again. On one hand envying her having such a handsome brother, on the other hand acting familiar by trying to put her arm around Ruby's shoulder. But unexpectedly, before she could touch Ruby, she was grabbed by Isuke. "Are you thick-skinned, or is there something wrong with your brain?"